What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another amazing Naruto story. What if Naruko Uzumaki was a 12-year-old Jounin? If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments. And also check the description box to original creator of this beautiful creation. The early morning sun peeked over the rooftops of Konoha, casting a soft, golden glow on the quiet village streets. All was peaceful, at least, until the calm was shattered by the unmistakable voice of Naruko Uzumaki. "Konohamaru, get back here," her voice carried with an air of calm authority, despite the playful irritation in her tone. Konohamaru, the rambunctious and ever-spirited boy, had once again slipped through her carefully planned training exercise. Naruko had dubbed it, the trial of endless push-ups, a test of both stamina and patience, but clearly, Konohamaru lacked the latter. He bolted away from the training grounds with the speed of a startled cat, leaving behind a trail of dust and the faint scent of burning sandals. Perched on the Hokage's rooftop, Naruko stood with her arms crossed, her golden hair catching the early sunlight. The long, flowing braids, intertwined with beads and ribbons, moved gently in the breeze. She wore a simple Jounin vest over an elegant kimono adorned with swirling bubble patterns, a reflection of her unique blend of wisdom and whimsy. In her hand, she held a small pipe, not for smoke but for blowing bubbles. She raised it to her lips, blowing a slow, steady stream of iridescent orbs into the sky. "Konohamaru," she murmured softly, watching the boy's figure dart through the streets below. "You know you can't outrun life's lessons forever." Beside her, Tsurumi, her summon and the daughter of Enma, stood with her arms crossed, her tail swishing back and forth with irritation. The young monkey, though sharp and witty, often found Naruko's methods perplexing. "You let him go again," Tsurumi noted, her tone edged with exasperation. "How's he supposed to learn if you keep letting him run off like that?" Naruko remained unbothered, blowing another soft trail of bubbles that floated lazily into the air. "It's not about chasing him down, Tsurumi. It's about letting him come back when he's ready to face the lesson." Tsurumi rolled her eyes. "And what happens if he just keeps running? Are you going to blow bubbles at him until he decides to come back?" Naruko's lips curled into a small smile, her eyes still fixed on the horizon where Konohamaru had disappeared. "Bubbles are fragile, delicate things," she said thoughtfully. "But even something fragile can carry meaning. He'll come back when he realizes that." Tsurumi snorted, clearly unimpressed. "You're getting too philosophical about this. The kid is just running away from push-ups, not the meaning of life." But Naruko's attention had already shifted. She could sense where Konohamaru was headed, and it pleased her. The boy was running directly toward her next training setup, the one she had laid out hours before. Down in the village, Konohamaru darted between alleyways, his chest heaving with exertion as he sprinted away from the training grounds. A grin spread across his face, proud of himself for escaping once again. He could practically feel the thrill of victory, until he rounded a corner and came to a sudden halt. In front of him, blocking his path, were dozens of shimmering bubbles, floating effortlessly in the air. They glistened in the sunlight, each one reflecting the world in miniature, creating a surreal, dreamlike scene. "What?" Konohamaru muttered, blinking in confusion. At first, he thought they were just ordinary bubbles, harmless, playful. But as he took a step forward, the bubbles began to close in, forming a shimmering wall around him. They moved in tandem, swirling in gentle but precise patterns, creating an unbreakable barrier. "Naruko Nichan," Konohamaru called out, his voice full of frustration. "What is this?" Naruko's figure appeared at the end of the alleyway, her serene smile unchanged. She approached slowly, her pipe still in hand, blowing more bubbles as she walked. "You didn't think I'd just let you run off without a little guidance, did you?" Konohamaru glared at the bubbles. "This is ridiculous. Bubbles? How are bubbles supposed to stop me?" Naruko chuckled softly, stopping a few feet away from him. "Bubbles may seem fragile, but they can be powerful when used wisely. They move with the wind, not against it. Sometimes, the most delicate things carry the most important lessons." Konohamaru crossed his arms, unimpressed. "So what's the lesson here? That I can't outrun soap?" Naruko's eyes twinkled with amusement. "The lesson is that you can't run from what you need to face. You can keep trying, but eventually, life will bring you back to the same place. These bubbles, Konohamaru, they're not here to stop you. They're here to show you that some things can't be avoided." Konohamaru scowled, clearly not in the mood for another one of Naruko's philosophical lectures. He was a boy of action, not reflection, and he didn't see how bubbles could possibly teach him anything important. But as he stood there, surrounded by the shimmering orbs, something shifted in him. He watched the way the bubbles moved, how they floated effortlessly on the breeze, unaffected by the chaos around them. They didn't fight the wind, they simply moved with it. Konohamaru sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. Fine, what do I have to do? Naruko smiled, pleased with his willingness to engage. All you have to do is stop running. Face what's in front of you, even if it's uncomfortable. The bubbles will clear when you're ready. Up above, Naruko watched quietly as Konohamaru began to calm down, his energy slowly shifting from defiance to reflection. She blew another stream of bubbles, her mind drifting to her other students. Sasuke, Sakura, and Shikamaru, all genin she had been quietly observing over the last few weeks, were not far from the academy grounds, likely preparing for their day. She had always believed in the power of subtle guidance. The right word, the right lesson at the right time. It could change the course of a person's life. They're growing stronger, she murmured softly, her eyes following the trail of bubbles. But strength without wisdom is like wind without direction. They still have much to learn. Tsurumi, perched beside her on the rooftop, huffed in amusement. You always say that, but what if they don't want to learn? What if they're like Konohamaru, always running away from the lesson? Naruko's smile remained serene. You can't force a seed to grow before it's ready. You can only give it water, sunlight, and time. The rest is up to the seed. Tsurumi raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. And what if the seed decides to stay underground forever? Naruko chuckled softly. Then I'll keep watering it. One day, it will grow. It's inevitable. Tsurumi rolled her eyes but didn't argue further. She knew better than to question Naruko's patience. The young Jounin had an almost supernatural ability to wait, to watch the world unfold at its own pace without rushing anything. Later that day, as the village bustled with activity, Naruko found herself walking toward the academy grounds. The trio of genin she had been observing, Sasuke, Sakura, and Shikamaru, were gathered near the training grounds, talking quietly amongst themselves. Naruko approached them silently, her presence going unnoticed at first. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but commanding. The three of you, you've been training hard. The genin turned to face her, startled by her sudden appearance. Sasuke, ever the skeptic, crossed his arms and raised an eyebrow. What's it to you? Naruko smiled softly, unfazed by his attitude. I've been watching you. You're all growing stronger, but strength alone isn't enough. Sakura blinked, clearly confused. What do you mean? Naruko blew another stream of bubbles, watching them float lazily into the air. Strength without purpose is like wind without direction. It might be powerful, but it's chaotic. You need to understand the purpose of your strength, the why behind it. Shikamaru, leaning against a tree with his usual lazy demeanor, raised an eyebrow. And let me guess, you're here to tell us what that purpose is. Naruko chuckled, her eyes gleaming with amusement. No, that's something you have to figure out for yourselves. I'm just here to give you the tools you need to find it. Sasuke scoffed, clearly unimpressed. And what tools are those? More bubbles? Naruko's smile didn't falter. Sometimes, the simplest things can teach us the most profound lessons. But only if we're willing to listen. The three genin exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of her words. They had heard rumors about Naruko, the strange Jounin who taught with metaphors and bubbles, but they hadn't expected to encounter her like this. I'll leave you with this, Naruko said softly, her voice almost a whisper. A flower doesn't rush to bloom. It unfolds slowly, petal by petal, in its own time. Strength is like that. You can't force it. You can only nurture it and let it grow when it's ready. Sasuke, still skeptical, narrowed his eyes. What does that even mean? We don't have time for flowers and bubbles. There's a world out there that needs power, not patience. Naruko met his gaze, her blue eyes calm and unyielding. Power without understanding is like a flame in the wind. It burns brightly, but it won't last long. Patience isn't about waiting, Sasuke. It's about learning to see what's truly important. Sakura looked thoughtful, her brow furrowed. But how do we know when we're ready? When we're strong enough? Naruko smiled gently, blowing another stream of bubbles that floated between them. You'll know when your heart is at peace with your path. Strength isn't just about fighting. It's about knowing when not to fight. Shikamaru, who had been quiet for most of the conversation, sighed and looked up at the sky. "This sounds like a lot of trouble," he muttered, though there was a hint of curiosity in his voice. Naruko chuckled softly, recognizing that spark of thoughtfulness behind his usual laziness. "Trouble or not, Shikamaru, life has a way of bringing us back to the same lessons until we learn them." Sasuke, clearly growing impatient, turned to leave. "I don't have time for this. I need to train." Naruko didn't stop him. She simply nodded, letting him walk away. "You'll find your path, Sasuke. Just don't lose sight of who you are along the way." Sakura hesitated, torn between following Sasuke and staying to ask more questions. But eventually, she turned and followed him, glancing back at Naruko one last time before disappearing down the path. Shikamaru lingered for a moment longer, his eyes still fixed on the clouds overhead. "So, what's our next move?" he asked lazily, though there was an underlying sense of interest in his tone. Naruko blew another bubble, watching it float into the sky before answering. "For now, we observe. The world is moving, Shikamaru, and soon you'll have to make choices that will shape who you become. Pay attention. The answers are already around you." Shikamaru let out another sigh, but this time, there was a hint of a smile on his lips. "You really are troublesome, you know that?" Naruko grinned. "I've heard that before." With that, Shikamaru gave a lazy wave and started walking back toward the village, his hands in his pockets. Naruko watched him go, her expression thoughtful as she blew another trail of bubbles into the air. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Naruko made her way back to the Hokage's office. The village was bustling with activity, but her mind was calm, her thoughts drifting like the bubbles she so often released into the world. As she approached the office, she could sense a familiar presence waiting for her. Hiruzen Sarutobi, the third Hokage, sat at his desk, surrounded by paperwork but clearly waiting for her arrival. His wise old eyes softened as she entered the room. "Ah, Naruko," Hiruzen greeted her with a gentle smile. "How did the training go today?" Naruko returned the smile and blew a small bubble before responding. "The seeds are being planted, sensei. Slowly, but surely." Hiruzen nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. "Patience is a difficult lesson to teach, but you seem to have mastered it well. Konohamaru will benefit from your guidance, even if he doesn't see it now." Naruko's expression softened as she thought about the boy. "He'll find his way, in time. They all will." Hiruzen leaned back in his chair, watching her closely. "And what of the others? Sasuke, Sakura, Shikamaru, what do you see in them?" Naruko took a deep breath, her eyes distant as she considered the trio she had encountered that morning. Sasuke is walking a dangerous path. His desire for power may lead him away from what's truly important. Sakura is still discovering her own strength, she doesn't yet realize how much potential she has. And Shikamaru? Well, Shikamaru knows more than he lets on. He's wise beyond his years, but he needs a push. Hiruzen nodded thoughtfully. "They're in good hands with you watching over them." Naruko smiled, a quiet sense of purpose filling her. "I don't know about that. But I'll guide them as best I can." The two of them sat in companionable silence for a moment, the weight of the world pressing lightly on their shoulders. Outside, the village continued its daily life, unaware of the quiet moments of reflection that were shaping its future. "Do you think they'll be ready?" Hiruzen asked, his voice soft but filled with concern. Naruko glanced out the window, watching as the last rays of sunlight cast long shadows over the village. "None of us are ever truly ready," she replied, her voice steady. "But when the time comes, they'll rise to meet it. Like the wind that carries the bubbles, they'll find their way." Hiruzen smiled, his heart warmed by her words. "You've always had a way with metaphors, Naruko." Naruko chuckled softly, blowing one last bubble before turning to leave. "Bubbles are simple, but they teach us everything we need to know if we're willing to listen." As she walked out of the office and into the fading light, Naruko felt a sense of peace settle over her. The world was shifting, changing in ways she couldn't yet fully understand. But she knew one thing for certain: her role was to guide, to plant seeds of wisdom and patience, and to wait for them to bloom. Because, like the bubbles she loved so much, wisdom floated gently through the air, waiting for those who were ready to catch it. And in time, they would. The morning sun had barely risen, casting a soft, golden light across Konoha, when Naruko was already sitting cross-legged beneath a cherry blossom tree, her pipe resting lazily between her lips as bubbles drifted around her in a serene cloud. The village was still waking up, the streets mostly quiet save for the occasional birdsong and the sound of a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. It was Naruko's favorite time of day. The world was quiet enough to think, to reflect. Next to her, Tsurumi yawned, stretching her arms. I still don't get how you're so awake at this hour. Don't you ever get tired? Naruko, without looking, blew another bubble from her pipe. The morning is when the mind is clearest. Before the world fills up with noise and distractions. It's the perfect time for introspection. Tsurumi rolled her eyes. Of course, you'd say something like that. Just then, a soft but determined voice interrupted their peaceful morning. Naruko-san? Naruko turned her head slightly, her curious blue eyes landing on a small figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was Hanabi Hyuga, younger sister of Hinata, with her pale lavender eyes focused on Naruko with an intensity that belied her age. Ah, Hanabi-chan. Naruko greeted warmly, smiling around her pipe. What brings you out here so early? Are you here to enjoy the peace of the morning? Hanabi hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, her eyes betraying a flicker of excitement. I saw you yesterday, with Konohamaru and the bubble jutsu. It was impressive. Naruko chuckled softly, tapping her pipe against the palm of her hand. Impressive, huh? Most people think they're silly. You must see deeper than the surface. Hanabi's cheeks flushed just the slightest bit, though whether it was from the compliment or the mention of Konohamaru, Naruko couldn't be sure. No, I think there's more to it. The way you used them, it wasn't just about strength. It was about control. I want to learn that kind of control. Naruko smiled, her expression gentle and understanding. Control, Control is important, yes. But it's not just about controlling your jutsu, it's about understanding it. Becoming one with it. Hanabi nodded, clearly intrigued by Naruko's words. That's what I want to learn. I've been training in the gentle fist, but I think I need something more. Naruko stood up slowly, brushing off her clothes, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. You want to learn from me, then? Hanabi met her gaze, her posture straight and resolute. Yes, I want to be your apprentice. Tsurumi blinked, clearly surprised. Wait, what? You want to learn bubbles? Hanabi nodded seriously. Yes, I think there's more to them than people realize. Naruko's grin widened. You have a good eye, Hanabi-chan. Most wouldn't look past the surface. Alright, then. If you're serious about learning, I'll teach you. But first, let's have some tea. The two of them were soon seated under the cherry blossom tree, Naruko pouring tea into delicate cups she brought out from seemingly nowhere. Hanabi sat across from her, watching carefully as Naruko handled everything with a calm, graceful air that seemed almost out of place for someone their age. The bubbles still floated lazily around them, adding to the strange serenity of the moment. You see, Hanabi-chan, Naruko began, as she handed the cup to her new apprentice, a good ninja understands not just their own abilities, but the world around them. Everything is connected, like the flow of tea, smooth, uninterrupted, always finding its way. Hanabi took a sip, trying to absorb the lesson along with the tea. So, bubbles are like tea? Naruko chuckled softly, setting her cup down. In a way, bubbles, tea, jutsu, they all have something in common. They exist in balance. Too much force, and they break. Too little, and they fade away. But if you understand the flow, you can guide them, let them reach their full potential. Hanabi, her mind now fully captivated by Naruko's words, nodded eagerly. I see. Balance? Naruko leaned back, blowing a long, slow stream of bubbles from her pipe. Exactly. That's what most people don't understand. They focus too much on power. But true strength comes from knowing when not to use it. From behind a nearby tree, a faint rustle caught Naruko's attention. Without looking up, she spoke. You can come out, Konohamaru. Konohamaru sheepishly stepped into view, clearly embarrassed to have been caught eavesdropping. Hey, Naruko-nisan. Hanabi. I wasn't, spying or anything. Naruko smiled knowingly. Of course not. You're just here because you're curious, right? Konohamaru scratched the back of his head, laughing awkwardly. Yeah, something like that. Hanabi's pale eyes flickered to him, her cheeks flushing slightly again. She quickly looked away, pretending to focus on her tea. Naruko, ever the keen observer, noticed the interaction but said nothing. Instead, she turned to Konohamaru with her usual calm demeanor. Konohamaru, you could learn a thing or two from Hanabi-chan. She's seeking balance. Maybe that's something you should think about in your own training. Konohamaru blinked, clearly confused. Balance? With bubbles? Naruko nodded sagely. Balance with everything. Even in the chaos of battle, there is always a moment of stillness. Find that stillness, and you'll find your path. Konohamaru scratched his head, trying to wrap his mind around the idea. Yeah, okay, stillness. Got it. Tsurumi snickered from her perch on a nearby branch. He's got a long way to go. Naruko waved her off with a smile. We all do. That's why we're always learning. As the three of them sat in the gentle morning light, the scene would have seemed almost ridiculous to any passerby. Two young girls sipping tea and discussing philosophy, while bubbles floated in the air, with Konohamaru standing awkwardly nearby. But for Naruko, this was exactly how things were supposed to be. Every moment was an opportunity to teach, to learn, to connect. And Hanabi, for her part, felt something shift inside her. Naruko's words resonated with her in a way that no other lesson had. She could feel herself starting to see the world differently, to appreciate the delicate balance that Naruko spoke of. The news that Hanabi Hyuga had chosen Naruko Uzumaki as her mentor spread quickly through the Hyuga compound, much to the horror of certain family members. Neji, in particular, was beside himself. Bubbles? He muttered to Hinata as they watched Hanabi practicing with a bubble blower in the training yard. Our clan is renowned for the gentle fist, and now she's learning bubbles? Hinata, ever the peacemaker, smiled gently. Naruko is very strong. If Hanabi-chan wants to learn from her, I'm sure it will help her grow. Neji sighed, crossing his arms as he watched Hanabi blow a bubble and then attempt to pop it with a controlled burst of chakra. Still, it's unorthodox. Hinata chuckled softly. Yes, but maybe that's exactly what Hanabi-chan needs. Meanwhile, back in the training yard, Hanabi watched her bubble float in the air, her eyes filled with determination. She could feel it now, the balance Naruko had talked about. The flow of chakra, the control, the stillness. And as Konohamaru passed by, giving her an awkward wave, Hanabi's cheeks flushed again. Maybe balance wasn't the only thing on her mind. Naruko, watching from the sidelines, blew another bubble from her pipe, a knowing smile on her lips. Ah, young hearts. Like bubbles in the breeze, delicate but full of possibility. Tsurumi groaned. You're getting sappier by the day. Naruko just winked. It's all part of the balance, Tsurumi. All part of the balance. The early morning light was just beginning to filter through the trees as Naruko made her way to the Hokage's office. In one hand, she carried a small teapot, steam rising lazily from its spout. Her pipe, as always, rested between her lips, the occasional soap bubble floating away with each step she took. Tsurumi trailed behind her, half awake and clearly less enthusiastic about the early start. When Naruko arrived at the office, she didn't bother knocking, there was no need. The third Hokage, Hiruzen Sarutobi, sat behind his desk, looking out at the village with a serene expression. The man had seen countless mornings like this, but something about today seemed special, as if he had been expecting her. Good morning, sensei, Naruko greeted warmly as she stepped inside, setting the teapot down on the low table in the corner of the room. Hiruzen turned, smiling as he saw her. Ah, Naruko. I was wondering when you'd show up. I see you've brought the tea. Naruko nodded, already in the process of preparing the cups. Of course. It's the perfect time for it. Hiruzen rose from his desk, moving with a grace that belied his age, and sat across from her at the table. The two of them had developed this morning routine over the years, sharing tea and conversation before the village woke up, when the world still felt peaceful and untouched by the day's concerns. Naruko poured the tea with practiced ease, the steam curling upward in soft tendrils. She handed a cup to Hiruzen before taking her own, sitting across from him with her legs folded neatly beneath her. For a while, they simply sat in silence, sipping their tea and enjoying the tranquility of the moment. Naruko's bubbles drifted lazily around them, catching the morning light in delicate rainbows. Finally, Hiruzen spoke, his voice soft but filled with the weight of his years. You've grown quite a bit, Naruko. I see you've taken on an apprentice. Naruko smiled around her cup. Hanabi-chan. She has a good heart. She seeks balance in her training, much like I did when I was younger. Hiruzen chuckled. And she's taken to your unique approach? Naruko's smile widened. She's learning to appreciate the subtleties. Most people overlook bubbles, but Hanabi sees the potential in them. She understands that even something fragile can be powerful when used correctly. Hiruzen nodded thoughtfully. It's a good lesson. Many shinobi focus only on brute strength, but true power comes from understanding when to use that strength and when to hold back. Naruko leaned back, cradling her teacup in her hands. Exactly. Like tea, it flows, adapts to the shape of its cup, but it doesn't lose its essence. It's strong, but it doesn't force itself. It finds the path of least resistance, and that's where its power lies. Hiruzen raised an eyebrow, impressed. You've been thinking about this a lot, haven't you? Naruko blew a small bubble from her lips, watching as it floated gently upward. Always, sensei. There's wisdom in everything, if you're open to seeing it. Bubbles, tea, even the wind, they all have something to teach us. Hiruzen smiled, a deep warmth in his eyes. I'm proud of you, Naruko. You've taken everything I've taught you and made it your own. Your perspective on the world is unique. Naruko grinned, setting her cup down. Unique is just another word for unexpected. But that's what makes life interesting, right? It's the surprises that keep us growing. Hiruzen nodded in agreement, his gaze turning toward the window, where the village below was beginning to stir. Indeed, it's the unexpected moments that shape us the most. I think the village could learn a lot from your way of seeing things. Naruko glanced out the window as well, her expression thoughtful. Maybe, but people are afraid of what they don't understand. It's easy to dismiss bubbles as harmless because they're not flashy or destructive. But that's what makes them powerful. They don't need to be destructive to be effective. Hiruzen sipped his tea, letting the weight of her words sink in. That's a rare kind of wisdom, Naruko. Most shinobi never learn that lesson. Naruko shrugged modestly. It's all about balance. In life, in training, in everything. Too much force, and things break. Too little, and they slip through your fingers. But if you find that middle ground, you can accomplish anything. They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, both lost in their own thoughts. The soft clinking of teacups was the only sound in the room, punctuated by the occasional pop of a bubble as it met its end. Hiruzen watched her carefully, studying the way she carried herself with a calm that belied her age. Despite her youth, Naruko had an old soul, a wisdom that even he, with all his years, found refreshing. Do you ever wonder what's next for you? Hiruzen asked quietly, breaking the silence. Naruko tilted her head, considering the question. Next? I think next is just more of the same. More learning, more growing. Life doesn't have to be grand or complicated to be meaningful. Every day is a chance to learn something new. Hiruzen smiled. You remind me of myself when I was your age. Always searching for meaning in the small things. Naruko gave him a playful wink. Maybe I'm a little more bubbly, though. Hiruzen chuckled softly, shaking his head. Perhaps, but that's not a bad thing. The world could use more people who look for meaning in the simple things. Naruko leaned forward, resting her chin in her hands. I think people just need to slow down sometimes. We're all so busy trying to prove ourselves, trying to be stronger, faster, better. But sometimes the real strength comes from being still, from taking a moment to breathe. Hiruzen nodded. You're right, there's power in stillness, in reflection. Naruko grinned. Exactly. Like tea, you can't rush it. It has to brew at its own pace. If you try to force it, you ruin the whole experience. Hiruzen's eyes twinkled as he raised his cup in a small toast. To tea, then. And to the wisdom that comes with patience. Naruko clinked her cup against his, smiling brightly. To tea. As they finished their tea, the village outside had fully come to life, the streets bustling with activity. Hiruzen sighed contentedly, setting his cup down. Well, it seems the day has officially begun. Naruko stood, stretching her arms above her head with a satisfied yawn. Time to face the world, then. Hiruzen rose as well, his expression one of deep pride. Thank you for the tea, Naruko. And for the conversation. You've given me a lot to think about. Naruko flashed him a mischievous grin. That's what I'm here for, sensei. Keepin' things interesting. With that, she turned and headed for the door, her pipe already back between her lips, bubbles floating in her wake. As she stepped out into the bright morning, Tsurumi hopped up onto her shoulder, grumbling about another long day ahead. Hiruzen watched her go, the softest of smiles playing on his lips. The world was in good hands, he decided. Naruko, with her boundless optimism and deep well of wisdom, would be a guiding light for the village's future. And in the gentle swirl of bubbles that followed her, he saw the promise of new beginnings, fragile, beautiful, and full of endless potential. As the sun climbed higher in the sky and the streets of Konoha filled with the sounds of bustling villagers, Naruko made her way to her next task of the day. Her usual carefree air was still present, with bubbles trailing lazily behind her, but today there was a weight on her shoulders. A challenge lay ahead, one unlike any she'd faced before. Sasuke Uchiha. Naruko had seen him from afar for years, his brooding presence lingering at the edge of her awareness like a storm cloud. She knew his story, how his family had been torn apart by the actions of his brother, Itachi, and how that pain had consumed him. Sasuke wasn't like the other genin she interacted with. His suffering ran deep, and his path was clouded by anger, vengeance, and an insatiable need for power. But Naruko believed that even Sasuke could find balance. He, too, was like a bubble, fragile, drifting, yet filled with potential if only he could learn to control the forces pulling him apart. "Are you sure about this?" Tsurumi asked from her perch on Naruko's shoulder. "That kid's a walking disaster waiting to happen." Naruko blew a bubble thoughtfully, watching it float upward before speaking. "Sasuke's just like everyone else, he's lost. He's looking for something to fill the emptiness, but he's going about it the wrong way." Tsurumi snorted. "And you think bubbles are gonna fix him?" Naruko smiled softly, her eyes filled with quiet determination. "Not bubbles. Balance. All things need balance, Tsurumi. If I can help him find his, maybe he won't need to chase after power. Maybe he can find peace." Tsurumi fell silent, her usual snark subdued by the gravity in Naruko's tone. She had seen this side of Naruko before, the side that wasn't just the carefree, bubble-blowing philosopher, but the wise young shinobi who carried the weight of her own teachings with profound sincerity. Sasuke was at the training grounds, his form precise and deadly as he practiced with his kunai. His movements were sharp, each strike filled with an intensity that bordered on desperation. He moved like someone trying to fight ghosts, quick, silent, and unrelenting. Naruko approached quietly, watching him for a moment before speaking. "You're fast, but you're pushing too hard." Sasuke froze, mid-strike, his dark eyes narrowing as he turned to face her. "What do you want, Naruko?" Naruko took a few steps closer, casually blowing a bubble from her pipe. "I want to help you." Sasuke's eyes flickered with disdain. "I don't need help." Naruko's eyes softened, but her smile remained. "Everyone needs help, Sasuke. You're not different from anyone else." His jaw tightened, and Naruko could see the tension in his body. He didn't respond, just stared at her with a cold, guarded expression. Naruko stepped closer, her tone calm and unthreatening. "I know you've suffered," she said quietly. "What Itachi did, no one should have to go through that. But you're letting that pain drive you in the wrong direction." Sasuke's eyes flashed with anger, and he clenched his fists. "You don't know anything about me." Naruko blew another bubble, letting it drift lazily between them. "I know more than you think. Pain can be blinding. It can make you feel like the only way to fix what's broken is to destroy everything in your path. But that's not the answer." Sasuke's fists tightened, but he stayed silent, watching the bubble float toward him. His eyes followed it, and for a moment, he seemed to lose himself in its gentle, fragile existence. Then, with a sharp flick of his wrist, he popped the bubble with a kunai. Naruko didn't flinch, only smiled softly. "You see? That's the problem. You think power is the only way to solve your pain. But power without balance will only destroy you." Sasuke scowled, turning away from her. "I don't need your philosophy." Naruko tilted her head slightly, her tone still gentle. "Maybe not, but you need something. You're walking a path that leads to nothing but more pain, Sasuke. And deep down, you know that." Sasuke's shoulders tensed, and Naruko knew she had hit a nerve. But she didn't push him further. Instead, she stepped beside him, watching as he clenched his fists. "You don't have to be like him," Naruko said softly. "You don't have to become a shadow of Itachi." Sasuke's breath hitched, just barely, but enough for Naruko to notice. His grip on the kunai loosened, though he didn't look at her. Naruko continued, her voice steady, but filled with quiet compassion. "You're more than what happened to your family, Sasuke. But you have to choose what kind of person you want to be. If you keep chasing after revenge, you'll never find peace. Only more pain." Sasuke stayed silent, his face hard and unreadable, but Naruko could feel the turmoil in him. She didn't need him to respond, not yet. She knew this would take time. All things need balance, she murmured, as if speaking more to herself than to him. Even the most broken things can find a way to heal if they're given the chance. Sasuke turned slightly, just enough to look at her from the corner of his eye. And what do you think I need? Naruko smiled, though it was a sad smile. You need time. You need to stop running from the pain and face it. Not with anger, but with understanding. Sasuke let out a sharp breath, his fists unclenching as he stared at the ground. You're wasting your time. Naruko shook her head. No time spent trying to help someone is wasted. If I can plant even a small seed of change in you, it's worth it. Sasuke didn't respond immediately, but the anger in his posture seemed to soften, just the tiniest bit. Naruko didn't push him any further. She knew better than anyone that change wasn't something that happened overnight. It was like tea, slow, steady, and patient. You couldn't rush it, and sometimes, the best thing you could do was let it steep on its own. She blew one last bubble, letting it float between them before walking away, leaving Sasuke standing there alone, deep in thought. As she walked back toward the village, Tsurumi, who had been quiet throughout the entire conversation, finally spoke up. Do you really think you can help him? Naruko's smile returned, gentle and full of hope. I don't know, but he deserves a chance to find balance. Just like anyone else. Tsurumi grunted. You really believe in this balance stuff, don't you? Naruko blew another bubble, watching it catch the wind. All things need balance, Tsurumi. Even Sasuke. And with that, she continued her walk, knowing that the road ahead with Sasuke would be long and difficult, but also knowing that every journey toward balance began with a single step. If anyone could help him find that balance, she believed it was her. The next morning was bright and crisp, the air filled with the sounds of birds chirping as Naruko sat cross-legged under her favorite cherry blossom tree, her pipe resting in her mouth as she blew soft streams of bubbles into the cool breeze. Across from her sat Hanabi and Konohamaru, both watching with wide eyes as Naruko's bubbles shimmered in the sunlight. Today's lesson was about more than just bubbles. Alright, you two, Naruko began, her voice soft but commanding. Today, we're going to learn about something very important. Control, balance, and understanding your own limits. Konohamaru, who had finally recovered from his previous bubble-induced training session, groaned dramatically. More bubbles, Naruko-ni-chan? Hanabi, on the other hand, looked intrigued, her pale lavender eyes focused intently on the floating bubbles around them. I'm ready, Naruko-sensei. Naruko smiled at Hanabi's enthusiasm, though she knew this wouldn't be an easy lesson. Control and balance weren't things you could simply teach through physical exercises. It required patience, introspection, and, most of all, trust in oneself. I want you both to understand that jutsu, chakra, and strength aren't the only things that make a ninja great, Naruko continued, blowing another stream of bubbles. It's about understanding the flow of energy around you and within you. Like tea or bubbles, if you force them, they'll break. But if you let them flow naturally, they become something powerful. Konohamaru tilted his head. But how do bubbles have power? Naruko smiled warmly, her eyes glinting with wisdom far beyond her years. It's not the bubbles themselves, Konohamaru. It's the lesson they teach. Even something fragile can be strong if used the right way. You don't always need brute strength to win a battle. Sometimes you need to adapt, to flow with the situation instead of forcing your way through it. Hanabi nodded slowly, her gaze flickering between the bubbles and Naruko. I think I understand. Naruko stood up, her long blonde hair catching in the wind as she gestured for them to follow. Good. Now, let's start with a simple exercise. She led them to a small clearing just beyond the cherry blossom trees, the ground covered in soft grass and bathed in morning sunlight. The perfect spot for what she had in mind. Today's training isn't about physical strength, Naruko explained as she pulled out a small jar from her pouch. She opened it, revealing a special mix of chakra-infused bubble soap. It's about controlling your chakra, finding balance in every movement. I want you both to make bubbles. Konohamaru stared at her in disbelief. Bubbles? Really? Hanabi, however, was already reaching for the jar, clearly eager to begin. She had been captivated by Naruko's approach since the first time she saw her in action, and now, under her direct tutelage, she was determined to master this new form of control. Naruko handed them each a small bubble wand, her smile unwavering. It's not as easy as you think. You need to infuse the bubbles with your chakra, control the flow, and keep the balance. If you lose control, the bubble will pop. But if you find that perfect balance, you'll be able to use them in ways you never thought possible. Konohamaru sighed but took the wand, clearly skeptical. Alright, Naruko Nichan, I'll give it a try. Naruko watched as they both dipped their wands into the soap and blew their first bubbles. As expected, Konohamaru's bubble popped almost immediately, while Hanabi's floated for a moment before fading into nothing. You're both trying too hard, Naruko explained patiently. You're forcing the chakra into the bubble, trying to control it. But chakra isn't something you can control by sheer will. It's a part of you, like breathing. You have to let it flow naturally. Hanabi frowned in concentration, clearly determined to get it right. She dipped her wand into the soap again, this time taking a deep breath before blowing softly. A single bubble formed, shimmering with chakra as it floated gently in the air. Naruko nodded in approval. That's better, Hanabi-chan. Now, hold on to that feeling, don't force it, just let it be. Konohamaru, still struggling, gave it another try. This time, his bubble lasted a little longer, but it still popped after a few seconds. This is harder than it looks, he grumbled. Naruko chuckled. Everything worth learning takes time, Konohamaru. But you're getting there. As the two continued to practice, Naruko stepped back, observing them with a proud smile. Hanabi's focus was sharp, her movements precise as she controlled the flow of chakra into each bubble. Konohamaru, though more frustrated, was showing improvement. His natural energy made it difficult for him to find the stillness Naruko had been talking about, but she knew he would get there with time. After several minutes, Naruko called them over, gesturing for them to sit beside her on the grass. You both did well today. This kind of training isn't about instant results. It's about learning to understand your own limits, and then pushing beyond them. Konohamaru flopped onto the ground, clearly exhausted. I never thought blowing bubbles could be so hard. Naruko laughed softly, resting her hand on his shoulder. That's because you're thinking about it like it's a game. But life isn't a game, Konohamaru. Everything has its purpose, even the smallest actions. Bubbles, tea, jutsu, they all require the same thing, balance. You can't force life to move the way you want it to. You have to flow with it, like a bubble drifting in the wind. Hanabi, sitting quietly beside them, nodded thoughtfully. Balance is everything. Naruko glanced at her with a proud smile. Exactly, Hanabi-chan. Balance is what makes you strong. It's what gives you control over your life, your jutsu, and your future. If you can master that, nothing can stop you. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the wind rustling gently through the trees. Konohamaru seemed to be deep in thought, while Hanabi watched the bubbles still floating lazily around them, her mind clearly working through everything she had learned. Finally, Naruko stood up, her pipe back between her lips as she blew one last bubble into the air. Remember, the greatest strength isn't always the one that can destroy. Sometimes, it's the one that can adapt, the one that can find peace in the middle of chaos. As she turned to walk back toward the village, Hanabi and Konohamaru followed her, both carrying the weight of her words with them. They knew that Naruko's lessons weren't just about bubbles. They were about life, about finding balance in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. And as they walked, Naruko couldn't help but smile to herself. Teaching Hanabi and Konohamaru was proving to be more rewarding than she could have ever imagined. They were both filled with potential, and if she could help them find balance, maybe, just maybe, they could avoid some of the pain that had shaped so much of her own journey. All things need balance, Naruko murmured to herself, blowing another bubble into the wind. Even the smallest of us. Naruko sat across from Shikamaru at an old, weathered table under the shade of a large oak tree. The shogi board between them was meticulously set, each piece gleaming in the soft afternoon light. Naruko, with her usual relaxed expression, had her pipe hanging from her lips, gently blowing bubbles that drifted lazily across the board. They floated between the pieces, as if part of the game itself. Shikamaru, his elbow propped on the table and his chin resting on his hand, stared at the board with his characteristic look of boredom mixed with deep concentration. He made his move, sliding a piece across the board with a slow, deliberate push. Troublesome game, he muttered under his breath. You always manage to get me thinking too much. Naruko smiled around her pipe, watching a bubble rise and hover just above Shikamaru's side of the board. Thinking is important, Shikamaru. But too much thinking can cloud your judgment. Sometimes, the simplest moves are the most effective. She leaned back, her bright blue eyes scanning the board as she contemplated her next move. "Shogi is like life, you know," she said softly, picking up one of her pieces and moving it forward. "You have to anticipate, yes, but if you overthink each step, you might miss the opportunities right in front of you." Shikamaru raised an eyebrow. "And what does that have to do with bubbles?" Naruko blew a small bubble from her pipe, watching it float between them. "Bubbles are fragile, but in their fragility, they teach us the importance of timing and balance. Move too quickly, and they pop. Move too slowly, and they drift out of reach." Shikamaru watched the bubble for a moment, seemingly mesmerized by it. Then, he sighed, moving another piece. "You make everything sound more complicated than it is." Naruko grinned, her tone light but full of meaning. "Life is complicated, but when you simplify it, you see that it's all about choices. The pieces you move, the paths you take, they all lead somewhere. You just have to decide where." Unbeknownst to the pair, Shikaku Nara stood quietly a few meters away, observing them with a keen eye. He had been watching Naruko and Shikamaru's interactions for a while now, intrigued by the way Naruko, a Jounin at such a young age, managed to weave wisdom into everything she did, even something as simple as a game of shogi. Naruko's approach to teaching wasn't typical. She didn't force lessons, didn't demand obedience or rigid training. Instead, she let her students, and apparently her peers, discover the lessons for themselves through gentle nudges and thought-provoking comments. Shikaku had heard about her reputation, of course, and he had seen her in action, but watching her now, he understood why the third Hokage had placed so much trust in her. Shikamaru, for his part, seemed more engaged in the game than usual. Sure, he played because he was good at it and because it was a way to pass the time, but with Naruko, there was something different. He wasn't just playing a game, he was thinking about life, about choices, about the balance she so often spoke of. Naruko made her move, sliding a piece into place with a soft click. "In life, Shikamaru, you can't control everything. Sometimes, things just happen, like the wind blowing bubbles in random directions. But if you're calm, if you stay balanced, you can adapt to wherever the wind takes you." Shikamaru stared at the board, then glanced at Naruko, who was blowing another stream of bubbles, their rainbow-colored surfaces catching the sunlight as they floated serenely around them. "You really think life is like bubbles?" he asked, his voice skeptical but curious. Naruko nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "In a way, yes. Life is delicate, ever-changing, and sometimes it can burst when you least expect it. But in every bubble, there's a moment of beauty, a moment where everything is perfect, even if just for a second. If you can find balance in those moments, you can handle whatever comes next." Shikamaru stared at her, his expression unreadable. For someone so young, Naruko carried herself with an air of wisdom that even he, a strategist by nature, found hard to ignore. She wasn't like anyone else he had met, she saw the world through a lens that most people overlooked. And in that, he found her endlessly fascinating. Shikaku, still observing from the shadows, couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in his son's engagement with Naruko. She was drawing him out in ways that few others could, making him think about life in broader terms, beyond just strategies and tactics. Naruko made her final move on the board, placing her piece down with a soft, satisfying click. "Checkmate," she said with a smile. Shikamaru blinked, staring at the board in disbelief. He had been so caught up in their conversation that he hadn't even noticed the trap she had laid for him. Slowly, a smile crept onto his face. "Troublesome woman." Naruko leaned back, her arms behind her head as she blew one last bubble. "Life's troublesome, Shikamaru, but it's also full of surprises. You just have to know when to let go and let the pieces fall where they may." Shikamaru stared at her, feeling something stir inside him. He wasn't quite sure what it was, but he knew that Naruko had a way of making him see the world differently, making him question the things he had taken for granted. "Maybe you're right," he admitted quietly, moving his final piece into a conceding position. "Maybe life is more like bubbles than I thought." Naruko smiled, her eyes twinkling with that same playful wisdom. "See? You're learning." As the two of them sat there, surrounded by drifting bubbles and the soft rustling of the leaves, Shikaku stepped away, quietly retreating back into the village. He didn't need to watch any longer. He had seen enough to know that Naruko was exactly what Shikamaru, and perhaps the village itself, needed. A reminder that sometimes the simplest things held the most profound lessons. Naruko glanced at the sky, watching as a bubble floated higher and higher before finally disappearing into the distance. The sky's the limit, Shikamaru. The only thing holding you back is the weight you put on yourself. Shikamaru leaned back, folding his arms behind his head, a small smile on his face. Yeah, I guess you're right. But sometimes, it's nice to just watch the bubbles float. Naruko grinned. Exactly. Sometimes, you just need to let go and enjoy the ride. And with that, the two of them sat in comfortable silence, the game of shogi forgotten, as the bubbles danced in the warm afternoon breeze, carrying with them the quiet wisdom of a life in balance. The afternoon sun bathed Konoha in a warm, golden glow as Naruko sat under a blooming cherry blossom tree, a delicate tea set laid out before her. Across from her sat Sakura and Ino, their expressions a mix of curiosity and confusion as they watched Naruko blow a soft stream of bubbles from her ever-present pipe. The bubbles floated gently around them, catching the light and casting tiny rainbows across the table. Naruko poured tea into their cups with practiced ease, her movements calm and graceful. This had become a familiar scene. Naruko inviting them for tea and conversation, her approach to life always tinged with an air of mystery and depth. Today, the topic was flowers. So, why flowers? Ino asked, leaning forward slightly. I mean, I work with them all the time at the shop, and I know they're beautiful and all, but what's the deeper meaning you always seem to find in everything? Sakura, sitting beside her, nodded in agreement, curious but unsure of where Naruko was going with this. Yeah, you always have some kind of wisdom to share, Naruko. What's the deal with flowers? Naruko smiled softly, her eyes twinkling with that familiar mix of warmth and insight. She placed her pipe down, letting a few more bubbles drift lazily around them. Flowers are more than just decoration, she began, her voice gentle but filled with purpose. They represent the cycle of life. They bloom, they wither, they return to the earth, and then they bloom again. It's a reminder that nothing is permanent, and that's what makes life beautiful. Ino blinked, taken aback by the simplicity of the explanation. So, flowers are like life? They come and go? Naruko nodded, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her teacup. Exactly. But it's not just about their fragility. It's about how they bloom despite it. Flowers don't know how long they have, they just bloom, as fully and as beautifully as they can, even if it's only for a moment. Sakura tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. So, you're saying we should live like flowers? Just bloom while we can? Naruko smiled, her voice becoming even softer. Yes, in a way. Life is unpredictable, and we don't always know how much time we have. But instead of worrying about that, we should focus on blooming, on being the best version of ourselves, no matter how long or short our time may be. Ino leaned back, crossing her arms as she thought about Naruko's words. I never really thought of it that way. I guess I've always been more focused on what's coming next, instead of just being in the moment. Naruko poured more tea into Ino's cup, her movements slow and deliberate. That's the thing about flowers, Ino. They don't rush to bloom, and they don't worry about when their petals will fall. They exist fully in each moment, letting the sun, the rain, and the soil guide them. They trust the process. Sakura picked up her cup, staring into the tea as if it held the answers to Naruko's wisdom. But what about when the petals fall? When everything seems to end? Naruko blew another small bubble from her pipe, watching it float before answering. Even when petals fall, they nourish the earth. They become part of the cycle, part of something bigger. Nothing ever truly ends, it just changes form. Ino, still digesting the conversation, glanced at the flowers surrounding them, blooming in full force around the village. So even after we're gone, we leave something behind? Like the flowers? Naruko nodded, her smile filled with a quiet understanding. Exactly. Our actions, our kindness, our love, they continue to bloom in the hearts of others, even after we're no longer here. That's why it's important to live fully, to bloom as brightly as we can, because we never know who might be watching, who might be touched by our presence. Unbeknownst to the trio, Ino's father, Inoichi Yamanaka, stood quietly nearby, listening to the conversation with growing interest. He had always known Naruko was wise beyond her years, but hearing her talk to the girls like this, teaching them, guiding them, made him see her in a new light. She wasn't just a peer to his daughter, she was a teacher, a mentor, and in some ways, a philosopher. As he listened, Inoichi couldn't help but feel a deep sense of respect for the young Jounin. Naruko's words, though simple, held profound meaning, and he could see the way they were impacting both Ino and Sakura. These weren't just idle musings, they were lessons in how to live. Naruko, unaware of Inoichi's presence, continued to speak, her voice soft but clear. The thing about flowers, about life, is that we can't control the rain or the wind, or how long our petals last. But we can choose how brightly we bloom while we're here. That's the beauty of it. Even in the face of uncertainty, we have the power to make something beautiful. Ino looked at her cup of tea, her expression pensive. I guess. I've always been afraid of not being good enough. Of not blooming the way I should. Naruko reached out, placing a gentle hand on Ino's. The fact that you're here, that you're trying, means you're already blooming. Flowers don't compare themselves to each other, Ino. They just grow in their own way, at their own pace. You don't have to be like anyone else, you just have to be you. Sakura, quietly absorbing Naruko's words, added softly, and when we fall, it's not the end. Naruko smiled at her, her eyes filled with warmth. Exactly, Sakura. It's never the end. It's just another part of the cycle. And from those fallen petals, new life will always grow. Inoichi, listening from a distance, felt a sense of peace settle over him. Naruko's wisdom, though couched in the simplicity of flowers and tea, was something timeless, something that resonated deeply with anyone who truly listened. He was grateful that Ino had someone like Naruko in her life, someone who could teach her not just how to be a shinobi, but how to live fully and with purpose. As the conversation drifted back to lighter topics, Naruko poured more tea, her smile ever present as bubbles floated lazily around them. The three girls laughed softly, their earlier seriousness replaced with a sense of calm understanding. Inoichi stepped back, retreating quietly into the village, knowing that his daughter was in good hands. Naruko was more than just a peer to Ino and Sakura. She was a guide, a gentle reminder that even in a world of battles and chaos, there was beauty, there was balance, and there was always a reason to bloom. And as the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, Naruko's voice could still be heard, soft and full of meaning. All we can do is bloom where we're planted, and trust that the rest will fall into place. The cozy atmosphere of Ichiraku Ramen was filled with the familiar sounds of slurping noodles and the soft murmur of conversations. Naruko sat at the counter, her pipe resting beside her bowl as she blew bubbles lazily into the air. Next to her sat Choji, a look of contentment on his face as he devoured his third bowl of ramen. The rich aroma of broth and noodles filled the small stand, mingling with the occasional burst of spice from the dishes being served. Naruko, still blowing bubbles, paused to take a slow sip of her broth, savoring the flavor. You know, Choji, she began, her voice calm and thoughtful, there's something about ramen that always reminds me of balance. The way the flavors come together, each ingredient in harmony, complementing the others. Choji, his cheeks puffed out with noodles, nodded enthusiastically. That's what makes it so good. You can't just throw a bunch of stuff in a bowl and call it ramen. It has to be balanced. Naruko smiled at his response, watching as another bubble floated toward the ceiling. Exactly. It's the same with spices. Too much, and you overpower everything. Too little, and the dish feels incomplete. The key is balance. Choji swallowed his mouthful of noodles and looked at her curiously. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. But what does that have to do with anything outside of ramen? Naruko set her chopsticks down, her blue eyes twinkling with quiet wisdom. Spices are like the challenges we face in life, Choji. They add flavor, excitement, and sometimes even a little heat. But if you let one spice dominate everything, it throws you off balance. Life, like ramen, needs just the right amount of everything: joy, struggle, peace, and excitement, to be truly fulfilling. Choji blinked, clearly intrigued by the metaphor. So you're saying that when things get tough, it's just like adding spice? It's part of the recipe? Naruko nodded, her expression soft but filled with understanding. Exactly. Too much struggle, and life feels overwhelming. But if there's no challenge, no spice, life can feel bland and uninspired. It's all about finding the right mix, knowing when to lean into the heat and when to pull back. Unbeknownst to them, Choji's father, Choza Akamichi, had wandered into Ichiraku Ramen, drawn by the comforting smell of noodles. He had been about to join his son when he overheard the conversation. Now, he stood quietly to the side, listening in with a sense of pride and curiosity. He'd always known Naruko was different, wise beyond her years. But hearing her talk about something as simple as ramen and turning it into a life lesson impressed him even more. Choji, between bites of his ramen, considered Naruko's words. But sometimes, it feels like everything's too spicy, you know? Like there's too much going on, and it's hard to handle. Naruko blew another small bubble, watching it float gently toward the ceiling. That's when you need to take a step back and adjust the seasoning. Life will always throw challenges at you, but it's up to you to find the balance, to manage the heat. You can't let one bad moment ruin the whole dish. Choji wiped his mouth with a napkin, his expression thoughtful. I guess that makes sense. Sometimes when I get really frustrated or things feel out of control, I just want to eat. It's like, I'm trying to balance out the bad stuff with something I enjoy. Naruko smiled warmly, nodding. And that's okay, Choji. Finding comfort in small things, like a good bowl of ramen, is part of how we cope. But just like in cooking, you can't rely on one ingredient to carry the whole dish. You have to find balance in all parts of your life. Choji glanced down at his ramen, a soft chuckle escaping him. Who knew ramen could be so deep? Naruko laughed softly, her eyes sparkling with amusement. Everything in life can teach us something if we're willing to look for the lesson. Ramen, spices, even the bubbles we blow. They all remind us that balance is the key to everything. Choji slurped up the last of his noodles and leaned back, clearly satisfied, both with his meal and the conversation. I guess when you put it that way, it makes sense. Life's all about finding the right mix. Naruko took a sip of her tea, her expression serene. Exactly. You can't control every ingredient life throws at you, but you can choose how to mix them together. From his quiet spot in the corner, Choza smiled to himself, deeply impressed by Naruko's ability to turn such a simple moment into a lesson on life. He knew his son was in good hands with friends like her. People who understood the importance of balance, of living fully, and of embracing both the good and the difficult parts of life. As Choji and Naruko finished their ramen, Naruko leaned back with a satisfied sigh, her pipe resting at her side. Remember, Choji, she said softly, no matter how spicy life gets, you can always find a way to balance it. The key is not letting the heat overwhelm you. Choji grinned, nodding in agreement. I'll keep that in mind, Naruko. Thanks. Naruko smiled, her blue eyes filled with warmth. Anytime. And if you ever need help adjusting the spices, I'm always here. As the two of them stood to leave, Choza quietly slipped out of sight, a proud smile still playing on his lips. Naruko was more than just a fellow shinobi to his son. She was a guide, someone who understood the complexities of life and could teach others how to navigate them with grace and balance. And as the bubbles floated up from Naruko's pipe, disappearing into the rafters of the ramen stand, Choza couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, the world would be a little better if more people learned to live like Naruko, embracing the spice of life with balance and wisdom. The Ino Shika Cho trio, as they were often affectionately called, sat together in their usual spot, a quiet clearing near the edge of the village where they often gathered to talk over drinks and share stories. Shikaku Nara, Inoichi Yamanaka, and Choza Akamichi had been friends for years, their bond strengthened through battles, strategy, and countless evenings like this one. Tonight, however, the conversation wasn't about their usual topics of village affairs or family updates. No, tonight there was only one name on all their minds: Naruko Uzumaki. Choza poured sake into each of their cups, his brow furrowed in thought as he glanced at his two longtime friends. I've been meaning to bring something up, he began, swirling the liquid in his cup. It's about Naruko. My son and I had ramen with her the other day, and, well, she's something else. Shikaku, always the most laid back of the trio, took a sip of his sake and nodded. I've been watching her for a while now. She's unique, to say the least. Inoichi, who had been silently sipping his own drink, chimed in. I overheard her talking to Ino and Sakura the other day. They were having tea, and she was talking about flowers like she's been alive for centuries. The way she speaks, the way she teaches, it's beyond her years. Choza nodded, leaning forward slightly. That's exactly what I've been thinking. She sat there talking about ramen spices like they were a metaphor for life. And Choji, he's a smart kid, but not one to think too deeply about these things, was completely drawn in by it. She has this ability to make you see things differently. Shikaku chuckled softly, leaning back against a tree. It's not just the way she talks. It's how she lives. Naruko sees the world through a different lens. Everything, no matter how small, holds some kind of meaning to her. And somehow, she manages to teach others to see it too. Inoichi rested his cup on his knee, his expression thoughtful. She's been through more than most, that's for sure. Losing her parents, growing up as an orphan, and yet, she's the most balanced person I've ever met. How does someone like that not fall into bitterness or resentment? Shikaku nodded slowly. That's what's remarkable about her. She doesn't hold on to anger or pain. It's like she's found a way to turn everything, the good and the bad, into something meaningful. Choza, ever the practical one, leaned back with a sigh. She's had every reason to be like Sasuke, angry, full of vengeance, constantly seeking power. But instead, she's become the exact opposite. She finds strength in balance, in peace. That's rare, especially in someone so young. Shikaku smiled faintly, his eyes half closed as he let the evening breeze wash over them. I think that's why she's a Jounin already. It's not just her skill in battle. It's her ability to guide others, to see beyond the immediate, and to teach lessons that most of us take years to understand. Inoichi, always the more introspective of the trio, rubbed his chin thoughtfully. She's not just teaching Ino and Sakura, either. She's affecting all of us, even if we don't realize it. The way she talks, the way she makes you see the world, it sticks with you. I find myself thinking about the things she says long after the conversation is over. Choza raised an eyebrow. Like what? Inoichi smiled softly, glancing at his two friends. She said something the other day that stuck with me. We were talking about flowers, and she said, flowers don't rush to bloom, and they don't worry about when their petals will fall. They exist fully in each moment, letting the sun, the rain, and the soil guide them. It made me think, how often do we rush through life, worrying about what's coming next, instead of just being in the moment? Shikaku chuckled again, nodding in agreement. Sounds like Naruko, alright. She's got a way of making you question things you didn't even know you needed to question. Choza took another sip of his sake, staring into the fire that crackled softly in front of them. She's a teacher, plain and simple. But not like the ones we're used to. She doesn't force her lessons. She just lives them. And somehow, that's enough to make others want to follow. Inoichi nodded, his expression contemplative. It makes me wonder what the village will look like in a few years. If more of the next generation start thinking like her, start living like her, we could be looking at a very different Konoha. Shikaku smirked, his eyes gleaming with amusement. You think she's going to change the village, huh? Inoichi shrugged. Maybe not directly, but she's planting seeds. The way she talks, the way she moves through life, it's infectious. She's teaching these kids, without them even realizing it, how to find balance. How to live fully, without letting the world's chaos break them. Choza, always the realist, leaned back with a thoughtful expression. She's already started with Choji. He talks about her a lot, you know. Says she's always making him think about life in ways he never has before. Shikaku glanced at his friends, his expression softening. My son's the same. He doesn't say much, but I can tell she's gotten under his skin in a good way. Naruko's the kind of person who makes you question the way you see the world. That's something even I struggle with sometimes. Inoichi nodded in agreement. It's more than just her words, though. It's how she lives. She doesn't just talk about balance, she embodies it. Everything about her is carefully considered, like she's constantly aware of the world around her in ways we aren't. Shikaku smiled, raising his cup in a small toast. To Naruko Uzumaki, then. May she keep showing us how to live, even when we're too stubborn to admit we need the lesson. Choza and Inoichi raised their cups as well, their expressions filled with quiet respect. They each took a sip of their sake, letting the warmth of the drink settle in as the crackling fire illuminated their faces. As they sat in the quiet clearing, the conversation drifted back to lighter topics, but the impact of Naruko's presence in their lives lingered in the back of their minds. She was more than just a shinobi, more than just a Jounin. Naruko Uzumaki was a teacher, a philosopher, and in her own quiet way, she was changing the village, one conversation, one bubble, and one lesson at a time. Naruko sat in the quiet corner of Konoha's training grounds, a soft breeze rustling through the leaves as the afternoon sun bathed the area in a warm, golden light. As usual, she was blowing bubbles from her pipe, watching them float lazily upward before disappearing into the sky. On either side of her stood two very different shinobi, Shino Aburame and Kiba Inuzuka. Shino, ever composed, stood with his arms crossed, his eyes hidden behind his dark glasses. He radiated calm, quiet control, his presence almost blending into the surrounding nature. Kiba, on the other hand, couldn't sit still. His energy buzzed around him like an electric current as he paced back and forth, his hands gesturing wildly as he talked, Akamaru trotting along beside him. I don't get it, Naruko Nichan, Kiba was saying, his voice filled with frustration. Shino's always so, I don't know, boring. He never shows any excitement. How is that supposed to help in a fight? Shino, unfazed by the comment, adjusted his glasses and replied calmly, energy without control is useless. In battle, precision and calmness are more valuable than reckless enthusiasm. Kiba growled in annoyance, clearly not satisfied with the answer. Yeah, but if you're too calm, you'll miss the chance to attack. Naruko, sitting cross-legged on the grass, watched the two of them with a serene smile. She let a few more bubbles float into the air before speaking. You're both right, she said softly, her voice cutting through the tension like a warm breeze. But you're also both missing something important. Kiba and Shino turned to her, both curious to hear what she had to say. Naruko blew another bubble, watching it drift lazily between them. Kiba, you're full of energy, and that's a good thing. In battle, energy can give you the strength and speed you need to win. But if you let that energy run wild, it becomes reckless. You lose focus, and that's when mistakes happen. Kiba folded his arms, still looking unconvinced. So you're saying I should be more like Shino? Naruko smiled gently. Not exactly. I'm saying you should learn to balance your energy. Use it when you need it, but don't let it control you. She then turned to Shino, her expression softening. And you, Shino, you have the opposite problem. You're calm and precise, but sometimes you hold back too much. You're so focused on maintaining control that you forget to let your energy out when it's needed. Shino, ever composed, tilted his head slightly. I see your point, but I believe that control is the key to victory. Recklessness can lead to unnecessary risks. Naruko nodded, her blue eyes twinkling with understanding. Control is important, yes. But if you hold back too much, you might miss an opportunity. It's all about balance, finding the middle ground between calmness and energy. Kiba, clearly struggling to understand, scratched his head. So what, we're supposed to, balance each other out? Naruko smiled. In a way, yes. You're both strong in your own way, but you could learn a lot from each other. Kiba, you could learn to channel your energy into something more focused, more precise. And Shino, you could learn to tap into your energy when the moment calls for it. Shino adjusted his glasses again, his voice measured. So you're suggesting that we adapt to each other's strengths? Naruko nodded, blowing another small bubble. Exactly. The world is full of opposites, calm and energy, light and dark, strength and precision. But the strongest people are the ones who can balance those opposites within themselves. Kiba, still looking a little skeptical, sat down next to Naruko, his hands resting on his knees. But how do you do that? How do you balance being calm and full of energy at the same time? Naruko took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh scent of the forest around them. It's about knowing when to act and when to wait, when to push forward and when to hold back. Life is like a river, you need to flow with it, not fight against it. Sometimes you need to move quickly, like rushing water. But other times you need to be still, like the calm surface of a lake. Kiba frowned, clearly trying to picture what she was saying. That sounds kinda complicated. Naruko chuckled softly, her eyes warm. It's not as complicated as it sounds. You already know how to do it. You just need to trust yourself. In battle, there are moments when you need to strike fast, but there are also moments when you need to step back and observe. It's the same with your energy. You need to know when to let it out and when to hold it in. Shino, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. And how do you propose we find this balance? Naruko looked between them, her expression thoughtful. Start by understanding each other's strengths. Kiba, watch how Shino moves, how he controls his energy, even in the heat of battle. And Shino, watch how Kiba channels his energy into his attacks. Then, try to bring those elements into your own training. Kiba looked over at Shino, his expression softening just a bit. I guess. I've never really thought about how Shino fights. I'm always so caught up in what I'm doing. Shino nodded in agreement. The same could be said for me. I focus on my own methods without considering the value of Kiba's approach. Naruko smiled, satisfied with their responses. That's the first step. Understanding that you can learn from each other, and that both of your approaches have value. Kiba let out a long breath, rubbing the back of his neck. Alright, I guess I'll give it a try. But no promises, okay? Naruko chuckled softly, leaning back on her hands as she watched another bubble float away. That's all I ask, Kiba. Just give it a try. Balance isn't something you master overnight. It's something you practice, something you grow into. Shino, always the more introspective one, nodded thoughtfully. Balance is a journey, not a destination. Naruko smiled at his words. Exactly. And once you start the journey, you'll find that you're capable of more than you ever thought possible. The three of them sat in silence for a while, the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves and the occasional pop of a bubble filling the air. Kiba leaned back, his hands resting behind his head as he stared up at the sky. I guess balance isn't such a bad idea, he admitted, a small grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. But I still like being full of energy. Naruko grinned, her eyes sparkling with amusement. And that's the beauty of it, Kiba. You don't have to give up your energy. You just have to learn how to use it wisely. Shino, calm as ever, adjusted his glasses once more. And I suppose I can learn to let go of control when necessary. Naruko blew one last bubble, watching it drift upward before disappearing into the blue sky. That's all part of the balance. As the afternoon sun began to set, the three of them sat together, quietly absorbing the lesson Naruko had shared. And though they were different, calm and energy, control and chaos, they were beginning to understand that, together, they could find a balance that made them stronger than ever before. The sun was warm, casting a soft glow over the training grounds as Naruko guided Konohamaru and Hanabi through their bubble chakra exercises. It had become a familiar routine, working with chakra in ways that emphasized control, precision, and a kind of delicate strength that most shinobi didn't usually explore. Naruko, as always, moved with calm grace, her pipe in hand, occasionally blowing bubbles that shimmered iridescently in the sunlight. Konohamaru was deep in concentration, his brow furrowed as he struggled to maintain the delicate chakra balance needed to form the bubbles. Hanabi, ever focused and calm, was progressing quickly, her bubbles floating serenely around her as she mirrored her sensei's quiet control. Today, however, there was a new presence on the training grounds. Hinata Hyuga, dressed in her usual soft hues, stood a little way off, watching with quiet curiosity. She hadn't expected to come across this particular training session, but something about the way Naruko and her students manipulated the bubbles had drawn her in. Naruko noticed Hinata's presence right away, her sharp senses always attuned to her surroundings. She smiled softly, then blew a small bubble, sending it drifting toward Hinata in the gentlest way possible. The bubble floated lazily, reflecting the sunlight in soft colors as it approached Hinata, stopping just before her face. Hinata, Naruko said gently, her voice as calm as ever, you're watching from a distance. Come closer. These bubbles are not just for control, they hold a different kind of strength, one I think you might understand better than most. Hinata hesitated for a moment, then nodded and walked forward, her steps soft, as if she didn't want to disturb the peaceful atmosphere. Naruko-sensei, I didn't want to interrupt. I was just curious. Naruko smiled, her eyes warm with understanding. You're not interrupting. In fact, I think you might benefit from this exercise. After all, bubbles, like you, are a reflection of gentleness. They are delicate, yes, but within them, there is a hidden strength, one that only reveals itself when handled with care. Konohamaru, hearing this, smirked. You mean bubbles can be strong? They pop at the slightest touch. Naruko chuckled softly, blowing another bubble that floated lazily past Konohamaru's head. Strength isn't always about force, Konohamaru. It's about understanding when to push and when to let go. A bubble's strength lies in its ability to float freely, to adapt to the wind without resisting it. Hanabi, who had been quietly focused on her own bubbles, glanced at her older sister. Naruko-sensei is right, Hinata. The bubbles might seem fragile, but they teach us to be in harmony with our chakra, to let it flow instead of forcing it. Naruko nodded. Exactly. And Hinata, I think you'll find that the same applies to you. You've always been gentle, but within that gentleness, there's a quiet power. Like the bubble, your strength lies in your ability to move with the world around you, rather than pushing against it. Hinata's gaze softened as she listened, Her eyes filled with quiet admiration for Naruko's words. She had often struggled with the idea of strength, especially in comparison to her more forceful cousin, Neji, and even her sister, Hanabi. But Naruko's approach was different. She didn't see strength in terms of raw power. She saw it in the ability to find balance, to adapt, and to let go. Naruko blew another bubble, this one infused with a soft glow, and let it float toward Hinata. "Try it," she said softly. "Let your chakra flow into the bubble. Don't force it, just let it happen naturally. Feel the gentleness within you, and let that guide your chakra." Hinata hesitated, then nodded slowly. She formed a small amount of chakra in her hand and gently released it into the bubble. For a moment, the bubble shimmered, almost as if it were reflecting the very essence of Hinata's soft and kind-hearted nature. It floated upward, stable and serene, catching the light as it drifted lazily through the air. Naruko smiled. "See? Just like that. Your chakra isn't about forcing things into place. It's about letting your natural gentleness shape it. You are more like the bubble than you know, Hinata. Soft, but filled with hidden strength." Hinata watched the bubble float away, her eyes wide with wonder. It's peaceful," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never thought chakra could feel like this." Naruko blew another bubble, watching as it floated alongside Hinata's. "Chakra is a reflection of who we are. You, Hinata, are gentle by nature, but that doesn't mean you're weak. It means you understand the flow of the world better than most. You're in tune with it, just like the bubble is with the wind." Konohamaru, still trying to form his own bubble, sighed in frustration. "I don't get it. I keep trying to control it, but it just pops." Naruko turned her calm gaze to him. "That's because you're trying too hard, Konohamaru. Control isn't about forcing something to happen. It's about guiding it, like how a bubble floats. Let your chakra flow naturally, and trust in the process." Hanabi, who had been silently listening to the conversation, smiled softly as she watched Hinata. She could see that her sister was beginning to understand something deeper about herself, something that had always been there but had never been fully realized. Hinata, still watching the bubbles, felt a sense of peace settle over her. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she had to compare herself to anyone else, not to Neji, not to Hanabi. She was simply herself, and that was enough. Naruko, ever the quiet guide, sipped her tea and blew one last bubble into the air. "Remember, Hinata," she said softly, "strength comes in many forms. Sometimes, the gentlest touch is the most powerful of all." Hinata nodded, her heart feeling lighter than it had in years. And as the bubbles floated gently into the sky, she couldn't help but feel that, like them, she was finally beginning to find her own path. The broken kunai was a favorite spot for Konoha's shinobi, a low-lit, cozy bar tucked away from the busier streets of the village. It was the kind of place where Jounin could relax, share stories, and, most importantly, gossip about their students after a long day of training. Tonight, however, there was something different in the air, something that had all the Jounin buzzing with curiosity. Naruko Uzumaki, who had recently become a Jounin herself, was sitting at the bar, calmly sipping on her tea and blowing bubbles from her ever-present pipe. The soft glow of the bar's lights caught the bubbles, making them shimmer like tiny orbs of light as they floated lazily around the room. It wasn't unusual to see Naruko here. She had quickly become a regular fixture among the more seasoned Jounin. What was unusual was the topic of conversation tonight. The subtle changes they'd been noticing in their students. Asuma, sitting with a drink in hand, leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know," he began, glancing at the others gathered around the table, "I've noticed something about Ino lately. She's been more reflective. It's like she's taking more time to think things through before acting. Never used to be that way." Kurenai, who sat beside him, nodded in agreement. Hinata, too. She's always been quiet and thoughtful, but lately, there's a different kind of calm about her. It's like she's found a new level of control. Guy, as usual, was more animated as he chimed in. Even Lee's been more focused. I mean, he's always dedicated, but now it's like he's balancing his energy better. It's unusual, but it's definitely improving his training. Kakashi, perched in his usual laid-back manner with a book in hand, glanced up from the table, his one visible eye crinkling in amusement. Naruko's been spending a lot of time with the younger generation. Could be her influence. The group turned their attention toward Naruko, who sat serenely at the bar, seemingly oblivious to their conversation as she blew another small stream of bubbles. The bubbles drifted across the room, adding an almost ethereal quality to the atmosphere. Kurenai raised an eyebrow, curious. "Naruko, what do you think?" Naruko looked up from her tea, a gentle smile on her lips as she placed her pipe down for a moment. "People change when they're given the space to grow," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet wisdom. "Sometimes, all they need is a little guidance and the right conditions to blossom." Asuma chuckled, leaning forward. "So, you're saying all these changes we're seeing in our students, that's your doing?" Naruko shook her head, her blue eyes twinkling with amusement. "Not mine. The changes are theirs. I've just been helping them see what was already inside them." Guy, ever the enthusiastic one, raised his glass in admiration. "Your methods are unconventional, but it seems you've found a way to reach them." Kakashi set his book down, eyeing Naruko with interest. "It's not just the students who are noticing, you know. You've gotten the attention of quite a few of us, too. Even I've seen the difference in Sasuke." Naruko smiled again, this time with a touch of mischief. "Balance," she said simply. "Everyone needs balance, calmness and energy, control and freedom. Once you find that balance, everything else falls into place." Kurenai leaned in, curious. "And how do you manage to teach that balance?" Naruko took another sip of her tea before answering. "It's not about forcing them to change. It's about showing them that the way they've always done things isn't the only way. For someone like Kiba, it's teaching him to slow down, to think before he acts. For someone like Hinata, it's reminding her that gentleness is a strength, not a weakness." Asuma nodded thoughtfully. "And what about Ino? I've noticed she's been more introspective lately." Naruko blew another bubble, watching it float up before responding. "Ino's been learning that it's okay to slow down, to take time to think before jumping into action. She's realizing that being strong isn't just about being loud or fast, it's about knowing when to listen, when to wait." The Jounin around the table exchanged glances, clearly impressed by Naruko's insights. It wasn't just that she had noticed these subtle changes, it was that she had been the one quietly guiding their students toward those changes, all without drawing attention to herself. Guy clapped his hands together, his smile wide. "Youth blossoms under your guidance, Naruko. Truly inspiring." Kakashi, ever the quiet observer, leaned back in his chair, his voice soft but filled with respect. "You've always had a way of seeing things that the rest of us overlook. I guess we shouldn't be surprised that the students are changing under your influence." Naruko shrugged, her smile soft. "It's not about changing them. It's about helping them find balance. Once they see that for themselves, everything else falls into place." As the group continued to talk, the atmosphere in the broken kunai remained relaxed, the gentle clink of glasses and soft murmur of conversation filling the space. Naruko, still quietly sipping her tea, blew another stream of bubbles into the air. The bubbles floated between the Jounin, light and delicate, just like the lessons she had been teaching their students. Inoichi, who had quietly entered the bar and sat a few seats down from the group, watched the scene unfold with quiet admiration. He had seen firsthand how Naruko's influence had affected Ino, and now, listening to the other Jounin talk, he realized just how widespread her reach had become. Asuma leaned back in his chair, raising his glass in a small toast. "Here's to Naruko, then. The quiet force of change in our village." The others joined in, raising their glasses in agreement, their faces filled with respect and appreciation for the young Jounin who had, in her own quiet way, begun to shape the next generation of shinobi. Naruko, ever humble, raised her teacup in return, her smile soft as another bubble floated lazily from her pipe. "To balance," she said quietly. "And to finding it, even in the smallest of moments." As the night wore on, the Jounin continued to talk and laugh, the conversation flowing as easily as the sake. And though they discussed many things, missions, battles, and old stories, there was one thing they all silently agreed on. Naruko Uzumaki, with her bubbles and her quiet wisdom, was teaching them all something they hadn't even realized they needed to learn. The academy classroom was alive with the usual energy of young students, their voices buzzing with excitement and curiosity. Konohamaru, seated at the front, bounced in his chair, clearly eager to see what Naruko would do next. Beside him sat Hanabi, her expression calm and focused, but with a hint of anticipation in her pale eyes. Today was different from the usual classes. The teacher was none other than Naruko Uzumaki. Naruko stood at the front of the room, her pipe hanging loosely from her lips as she blew a steady stream of bubbles into the air. The students watched in fascination as the bubbles floated around the room, their shimmering surfaces reflecting the light. Behind them, Iruka Amino, the regular teacher, stood quietly by, curious to see what Naruko had planned for the lesson. Naruko turned to face the class, her smile gentle as she addressed the students. Today, we're going to talk about something very important. Not jutsu, not chakra, but something that can help you in everything you do as shinobi. Konohamaru raised his hand immediately, his enthusiasm barely contained. Is it about being strong? Naruko smiled and shook her head. Not exactly, Konohamaru. It's about balance. The class quieted down, intrigued but unsure of what she meant. Hanabi, sitting next to Konohamaru, listened carefully, her focus sharp. Naruko continued, her voice calm but filled with intent. As shinobi, we face challenges every day. We train our bodies, our minds, and our jutsu. But none of that matters if we don't learn how to balance everything. It's not enough to be strong if you can't control that strength. She blew another bubble, letting it float gently across the room. Take this bubble, for example. It's delicate, fragile, and seems like it could pop at any moment. But if you handle it with care, if you balance your movements, it floats perfectly. The students watched as the bubble drifted effortlessly through the air, and Naruko's words began to sink in. Even Iruka, who had heard countless lessons in his time, found himself leaning forward, intrigued by Naruko's approach. Konohamaru furrowed his brow, clearly still thinking it through. But how does that help us with training? Naruko grinned, kneeling down in front of him so they were at eye level. Think about it this way, Konohamaru. When you're fighting, you can't just rely on strength or speed alone. If you're too reckless, you might miss something important. But if you're too cautious, you might never make a move. Balance means knowing when to act and when to wait. Hanabi nodded thoughtfully, her voice soft but clear. Like how we balance our chakra when using jutsu. Naruko beamed at her, clearly pleased with the connection. Exactly, Hanabi-chan. Just like that. You have to balance your chakra, your movements, your emotions. Everything works together. One of the students in the back raised their hand, a young boy with wide eyes. But how do we know when we're balanced? Naruko stood up, her smile never fading. You'll feel it. It's like when you're learning a new jutsu. At first, it feels awkward, but after practicing, it starts to feel natural. Balance is the same. You practice it every day, in small ways, until it becomes a part of everything you do. She then glanced toward Iruka, her eyes twinkling with a playful spark. Even teachers need balance. Iruka blinked, caught off guard by her directness. Me? What do you mean? Naruko turned to the class, addressing them all now. Iruka-sensei is one of the best teachers in the village. He's patient, kind, and cares about all of you. But even teachers can forget that balance is important. Sometimes we focus too much on what we think our students should know, and not enough on what they're already learning on their own. Iruka rubbed the back of his head, clearly flustered but thoughtful. I suppose I've been guilty of that a few times. Naruko smiled warmly. It's natural. We all want to make sure our students succeed. But sometimes, success comes from giving them space to find their own way, to learn their own lessons. The room fell into a quiet, reflective silence, the students absorbing her words in their own way. Even Konohamaru, who was usually bursting with energy, sat quietly, deep in thought. Naruko glanced at the class once more, her expression soft but serious. Being a shinobi isn't just about being the strongest or the fastest. It's about finding balance in everything you do, your strength, your emotions, your mind. When you learn to balance these things, you'll find that everything else becomes easier. She blew one final bubble, letting it float into the center of the room. The students watched in awe as it drifted gently between them, suspended in perfect harmony with the air around it. For today's lesson, Naruko continued, her voice light but meaningful, I want you all to focus on something small. Find a moment in your day where you feel balanced, where everything feels just right. It might be when you're practicing jutsu, or it might be when you're walking home. But when you find that moment, remember it. Hold on to it. Konohamaru raised his hand again, his face serious. And what if we don't find it? Naruko knelt down again, her eyes gentle as she met his gaze. Then you keep looking. Balance isn't something you find once and keep forever. It's something you practice every day. Some days, it will come easily. Other days, it won't. But that's okay. The important thing is that you keep trying. Hanabi, quiet as ever, spoke up. Like a bubble, right? Naruko smiled brightly at her, nodding. Yes, exactly like a bubble. It floats because it's balanced perfectly with the air around it. But it can only float as long as it maintains that balance. It's delicate, but that's what makes it beautiful. The class seemed to sit in a kind of hushed reverence. Even Iruka, who had taught countless lessons over the years, felt like he had learned something new. Naruko's lesson wasn't just about shinobi training, it was about life. About finding balance in the everyday, in the small moments that often went unnoticed. As the class came to a close, Naruko stood, her smile bright and full of warmth. That's all for today. Remember, balance is something you practice. It's not about being perfect, it's about trying. Konohamaru and Hanabi exchanged glances, both clearly moved by the lesson. They didn't say anything, but the look in their eyes showed that they had understood something deeper. Iruka, standing at the back of the room, approached Naruko as the students filed out. That was a remarkable lesson, Naruko. Naruko shrugged, still smiling. It's nothing special, just something I've learned along the way. Iruka shook his head, his expression serious but filled with admiration. You've given them something important today. And you've given me something to think about, too. Naruko blew one last bubble, letting it float lazily between them. We're all still learning, Iruka-sensei. Even the teachers. Iruka chuckled, nodding in agreement. I suppose you're right. Thank you, Naruko. Naruko waved off the thanks with a playful grin. Don't mention it. Just remember, balance isn't something you find. It's something you create. And with that, she turned, her pipe resting once again between her lips as she blew another soft stream of bubbles into the air, leaving the classroom filled with a sense of quiet wonder and reflection. Even for the most seasoned of teachers, there was always something new to learn from Naruko Uzumaki. The dimly lit office of the third Hokage felt heavier than usual, as if the very walls were bearing witness to the weight of the words about to be spoken. The thick, curling smoke from Hiruzen Sarutobi's pipe filled the room like gathering clouds before a storm, each swirl carrying with it an unspoken tension. Naruko stood before him, the flickering light from the candle on his desk casting long, wavering shadows across her face. It had been months since her last mission, months of relative peace, a peace that now felt as fragile as a bubble drifting in the wind, ready to burst at the faintest disturbance. She could sense it, that shift in the air, as if the village itself was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. Hiruzen sat behind his desk, his features partially obscured by the smoke. His eyes, usually calm and wise, held a trace of something Naruko had rarely seen in him, worry. The kind of worry that settled deep into the bones, like the first cold winds of a harsh winter. The soft clink of his pipe against the ashtray broke the silence, but the tension in the room remained, heavy and suffocating. Thank you for coming, Naruko, Hiruzen began, his voice carrying the weight of years of battle, of countless decisions made in the face of darkness. There was something in his tone that told her this wasn't just another mission. Naruko straightened slightly, her bright blue eyes locking with his, unblinking. Of course, sensei. What's the mission? For a moment, Hiruzen didn't answer. He took a slow puff from his pipe, watching the smoke curl and twist in the air before exhaling it in a long, deliberate breath. The swirling smoke seemed to carry with it his unspoken fears. Dark tendrils that twisted like the shadows of war creeping across the land. There's been chatter, he finally said, his voice low, almost as if the walls themselves might be listening. Rumors from Suna and Otto. We've received intelligence suggesting quiet, calculated movements. Movements that could lead to something far more dangerous. He paused, letting the words settle into the silence, heavy and foreboding. I fear war is on the horizon. Naruko's expression didn't falter, but inside, she felt the weight of his words settle over her like a shroud. War. The word hung in the air between them, thick and ominous. War was a darkness that swallowed everything, hope, life, and balance. It didn't discriminate, and it was coming. I need to prepare for what's coming, Hiruzen continued, his gaze hardening as if bracing himself against the inevitability of what lay ahead. If war is truly looming, I will need the best by my side. That means Jiraiya and Tsunade. However, he leaned forward slightly, setting his pipe down. Neither of them is currently in the village. And time, Naruko, is not on our side. Naruko nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of what he was asking. You want me to find them? Yes, Hiruzen replied, his voice edged with urgency. Jiraiya is somewhere in the land of fire, keeping an eye on certain interests of his. His tone made it clear what those interests likely were. Tsunade, however, has been moving from village to village, gambling and avoiding her past. She will be much harder to track down. Naruko remained silent for a moment, considering the task. Jiraiya had always been unpredictable, but Tsunade, she was like a ghost, haunted by the weight of her own pain, running from a village that had only ever brought her sorrow. Finding her would be a challenge. Convincing her to return? That would be something else entirely. She blew a soft bubble from her pipe, watching it float upward, delicate and fragile against the darkened room. It rose slowly, twisting and turning as it caught the faint flicker of candlelight. Naruko's eyes followed it, her mind already spinning with the complexity of the mission. Like the bubble, this piece they had clung to was beautiful but temporary. One wrong move, and it would shatter. It won't be easy, she said, her voice quiet but resolute. But I'll find them both. Hiruzen smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. The worry, the unspoken fears, still clung to him like shadows. I knew I could count on you, Naruko. Remember, he added, his tone shifting to something darker, time is of the essence. We can't afford delays if war is truly on the horizon. Naruko gave a small nod, but as she turned to leave, Hiruzen's voice called her back one last time. And Naruko, he said softly, his gaze more serious than ever, be careful. The world is changing, and the people you meet along the way may not be as they seem. Naruko paused, glancing back over her shoulder. In his eyes, she saw the weight of decades of leadership, of watching his village teeter on the edge of destruction time and time again. She understood his warning. The world was shifting, like tectonic plates beneath the surface, slow and almost imperceptible, but inevitable. I understand, Sensei, she replied, her voice steady. I'll be careful. With that, she stepped out of the Hokage's office and into the brisk night air of Konoha. The village was quiet, its streets bathed in the soft glow of lanterns, the houses standing like silent sentinels in the growing darkness. But to Naruko, the peace felt illusory, like the calm before a storm. She moved through the village, her footsteps light, but her mind heavy with thoughts of what lay ahead. Jiraiya and Tsunade, two of the most legendary shinobi in the world, both scarred by their pasts, both running from the shadows that clung to them. And now, it was up to her to bring them back. To stand with them in the face of the coming storm. As she reached the village gates, she paused, taking a deep breath of the cold, crisp air. The stars above twinkled like distant flames, far removed from the world below. For a moment, she wondered if they ever felt the weight of the world's pain. She raised her pipe to her lips once more, blowing another bubble. It floated upward, caught in the moonlight, shining like a fragile pearl in the night. Naruko watched as it rose higher and higher, before it finally popped, silent and sudden, leaving nothing but empty space behind. Balance, she murmured to herself, her voice barely more than a whisper. In war and peace, we need balance. And just like that, she stepped out of the gates, her resolve as firm as steel. The night closed around her, the world beyond the village feeling darker, more dangerous than ever. But Naruko moved forward, her heart steady, her mind focused. War was coming, but she would face it head-on. The world was shifting, and Naruko Uzumaki, with her quiet wisdom and strength, was ready to meet it. But even as she disappeared into the night, a darker thought lingered in the air behind her, like the faint echo of a storm yet to come. The world may be changing, but how long could even the strongest among them hold onto the light before it, too, was consumed by the darkness? Naruko stepped out of Konoha's gates, her silhouette swallowed by the vast darkness of the open world beyond the village walls. The quiet of the village had given way to the rustling wind, the murmur of trees swaying under the weight of the night's breeze, and the occasional sound of creatures moving unseen in the wilderness. Her journey had begun, but unlike her past missions, this one carried a weight heavier than any she had borne before. The path ahead was uncertain, both in its physical sense and in what it represented. It wasn't simply a matter of tracking down Jiraiya and Tsunade. It was about understanding what was coming, preparing for it, and knowing herself well enough to weather the inevitable storm. As she walked through the forest, Naruko's thoughts began to drift like the mist that settled among the trees. The forest was alive, the underbrush crackling beneath her feet as the world whispered around her. Shadows stretched long, tangled like the uncertainties she faced, twisting around her feet with each step forward. In her solitude, she began to reflect, her mind drawn to the lessons she had learned over the years. Each step was like a beat of meditation, and with each footfall, memories flooded back, of her training, of her mentors, of the countless lives she had touched and the countless more that remained to be guided. Jiraiya had always spoken of the cycles of the world, the endless ebb and flow of war and peace, like the ocean tides. Tsunade, on the other hand, had embodied strength wrapped in pain, a woman who had seen too much loss and chosen to turn away from it all. And Naruko, standing between them, was the one who had to bridge the gap, to bring them both back. But to do that, she had to be sure of her own path. The night stretched on, the forest becoming denser, more silent, as if the trees themselves held their breath. Every rustle of leaves, every faint crunch of the earth beneath her sandals seemed louder, more deliberate. It was as if the world was watching, waiting to see how Naruko would proceed. She came to a clearing where the moonlight broke through the canopy of trees, casting silvery beams across the earth. There, Naruko paused, letting her eyes close as she inhaled deeply, the cool night air filling her lungs. "What am I really seeking?" she murmured to herself, her voice carried away by the wind. Jiraiya had always been her mentor in so many ways, but he was also elusive, constantly disappearing into the horizon to chase after shadows. Tsunade, powerful and wise, had become a phantom of the past, running from the pain that had scarred her soul. They both embodied different reactions to war, Jiraiya, who sought to prevent it, and Tsunade, who had retreated from it. And Naruko, somewhere in the middle, felt the pull of both extremes. The night deepened, and Naruko resumed her walk, her senses sharpened by the quiet. The journey ahead wasn't just a mission to retrieve her mentors. It was about understanding the delicate balance that Jiraiya had spoken of, the line between fighting and yielding, between war and peace. And more importantly, it was about discovering where she fit in that balance. Naruko had always been different. She knew that. Her approach to the world was softer, more contemplative. While others sought strength in battle, Naruko sought strength in understanding. Her use of bubbles as a technique, gentle, fragile, yet surprisingly powerful, mirrored her philosophy. The world, she knew, was delicate, and sometimes the gentlest touch was the most powerful of all. But could such a philosophy survive the brutal reality of war? Could balance be maintained when the world was tearing itself apart? These were the questions that gnawed at her as she traveled through the wilderness, the darkness pressing in around her like the weight of her thoughts. At dawn, she reached a river that wound through the forest, its waters glistening in the first light of the sun. The river's flow was steady, but Naruko could see the subtle shifts in its currents, the places where the water rushed forward with ferocity, and the places where it slowed, almost still. It was like life itself, calm at times, chaotic at others, yet always moving forward. She knelt by the riverbank, cupping her hands to gather water. As the cool liquid trickled through her fingers, she thought of Jiraiya's teachings, how he had always compared life to a river. He had told her once that it wasn't about controlling the flow, but about moving with it, allowing it to guide her while remaining steady within herself. The world would shift and change, but Naruko had to find her own stillness amid the chaos. "Balance," she whispered again, watching the water ripple. It had become a mantra for her, a guiding principle, but now it felt more crucial than ever. The coming war would challenge everything she believed in. The idea of balance, so fragile like the bubbles she conjured, would be tested by the fire of battle. But she couldn't waver. She couldn't let the war that was looming consume her. As she rose to continue her journey, a bird took flight from the trees, its wings catching the light of the rising sun. Naruko watched it soar, free and unhindered, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always a path forward. She would find Jiraiya, and she would find Tsunade. And when the time came, she would stand beside them, not as a mere soldier in the coming war, but as a beacon of the balance they all sought in their own ways. The road ahead was long, and the shadows of war whispered from every corner, but Naruko moved with a quiet certainty. She wasn't just seeking her mentors, she was seeking a deeper understanding of herself, of her role in this ever-changing world. And as she continued on, the soft pop of a bubble echoed faintly in the air, a reminder that even the most delicate things could endure. The world was changing, but Naruko knew one truth above all. As long as she held onto her belief in balance, she would find her way through the storm, no matter how dark the path became. The forest was alive with secrets, the trees standing like silent sentinels in the moonlight, their branches twisted like the fingers of old gods, watching over the earth below. Naruko moved swiftly through the undergrowth, each step quiet and sure, her presence blending into the shadows like smoke. Behind her, the familiar warmth of Konoha faded, the village now just a distant memory shrouded in the gentle hum of crickets and the whisper of leaves stirred by the night wind. She was no stranger to the solitude of the path ahead. It stretched before her, uncertain, like a winding river cutting through jagged cliffs. But rivers, she knew, always find their way, carving through even the hardest stone. This mission was her current, pulling her forward, inexorable and steady. Jiraiya and Tsunade. The names alone carried weight. Legends born from the fire of past wars. But legends had shadows, and those shadows had grown long. War was always a storm on the horizon, distant thunder rumbling through the valleys of Suna and Otto, drawing ever closer. Hiruzen had seen the clouds gathering, and now it was Naruko's task to navigate the storm before it broke. As she moved beneath the canopy, the moon hung like a watchful eye, casting silver light across the forest floor. Each tree she passed was a giant, its branches clawing at the sky as if to keep the stars within reach. The path ahead was littered with uncertainties, much like the shadows that shifted with the breeze, alive, but fleeting. Naruko's pace never faltered, her breath steady and rhythmic, like the pulse of the earth beneath her feet. She had learned long ago that balance wasn't something given, it was something created, carved from the chaos, like a sculptor pulling form from a block of stone. The hours bled into one another until she reached the outskirts of the town where Jiraiya was last seen. It was late, the streets eerily quiet, their stone-paved paths glistening under the cold moonlight like the scales of a sleeping dragon. A few stragglers wandered the streets, their faces hollow, as though they, too, were carved by the world's indifferent hand. Naruko pulled her cloak tighter, becoming one with the shadows as she moved toward the inn. It was here she felt it, an all-too-familiar presence, like the ripple of a stone dropped into still water. Jiraiya. His chakra was unmistakable, a force that vibrated with a hidden warmth beneath his often playful exterior. Slowly, Naruko scanned the rooftops until her gaze settled on a familiar figure lounging against the roof's edge, his white hair glowing like a ghost in the moonlight. "Oi, Naruko." Jiraiya's voice carried down, playful and warm, but with an edge, like a blade hidden beneath a silk sheath. "I figured you'd track me down eventually." Naruko's lips curved into a small smile, though her mind was already weighed with the gravity of the task ahead. "Jiraiya-sensei," she called softly, "it's time to come home." Jiraiya leapt down, landing with a graceful thud. He folded his arms, a grin spread across his face, though his eyes held a weariness he couldn't quite hide. "Konoha must be desperate if they've sent you to track me down. Heard you've been making quite a name for yourself, Bubble Sage." Naruko let a bubble float from her pipe, watching it rise like a quiet star before it disappeared into the night. "Hiruzen-sensei needs you. He's worried. There are whispers, darker than usual, coming from Suna and Otto. He thinks war is coming, and he needs you at his side." Jiraiya's grin faltered, his face shadowed with the weight of memories that had no place in the light. "War, huh? I've heard the rumblings myself, but if Hiruzen's calling me back, things must be worse than I thought." Naruko's eyes, calm and unwavering, met his. "It is. But it's not just you, sensei. Tsunade's been gone too long. We need her strength, her heart. Without her, we won't survive what's coming." Jiraiya let out a long sigh, running a hand through his silver hair. "Tsunade? She's buried her heart somewhere even she can't reach. You know she won't come willingly, Naruko. She's running from more than just the village." Naruko's voice was gentle but firm, a river that refused to be diverted. "I know, but I'll bring her back. It's not just about the village, it's about the lives that hang in the balance. War doesn't care for the broken hearts of old legends. It will claim what it will unless we stand against it." Jiraiya studied her, his gaze softening as he took in the strength she carried. "You've grown, Naruko. There's something in you now, a light that wasn't there before. You found a balance most never do. But remember, carrying the weight of the world doesn't mean you had to do it alone." Naruko smiled faintly, though the edges of her expression were tinged with something darker, a knowledge born from too many battles fought in the quiet of her mind. "I know, sensei. But this isn't about me. This is about the village. It's about saving the people we love. The next morning dawned cold and quiet, the sun a pale disk rising slowly over the mountains, casting long fingers of light across the sleeping town. Jiraiya and Naruko moved through the forests like shadows, their path winding through villages and mountains, chasing rumors like fishermen casting nets into uncertain waters. Each story led them closer to Tsunade, the woman who had once been a pillar of strength, now hidden in the folds of her own sorrow. Days passed, each one a reflection of the other, until they finally arrived at a small town nestled in the mountains. The air here was thick with the scent of damp stone and wood smoke. Jiraiya's contacts had led them to a gambling house, a den of lost fortunes and forgotten dreams. Inside, the dice clattered like the bones of the dead, echoing through the smoky room. And there, at the far end, surrounded by the spoils of another loss, sat Tsunade. Jiraiya let out a sigh, his voice tinged with bittersweet nostalgia. Looks like she hasn't changed much. Naruko stepped forward, her presence cutting through the haze of the room like a breeze in the thick air. "Tsunade-sama," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of the world behind it. Tsunade glanced up, her golden eyes narrowing as she recognized the pair. "You too? What do you want?" Naruko held her gaze, her words steady as the earth beneath them. "Hiruzen-sensei sent us. War is coming, and the village needs you. We need your strength." Tsunade's expression hardened, her eyes clouded with memories she refused to relive. "I told him I'm done with that life. I'm not going back." Naruko stepped closer, her blue eyes filled with the calm determination of someone who had seen too much but still believed in the good that remained. "This isn't just about the village, Tsunade-sama. This is about the lives that will be lost if you don't return. You're the only one who can save them. Without you, the storm that's coming will sweep through us all." Tsunade clenched her jaw, the weight of the past pressing down on her like the gravity of old wounds. But Naruko didn't stop. "Balance," Naruko said softly, her words a lifeline thrown into the darkness. "You've spent years running from the pain, but now the village needs you to find that balance again. You are both strength and compassion, Tsunade-sama. The people who love you, they need both." For a long moment, Tsunade's silence filled the room, thick as smoke. Her gaze held Naruko's, searching for something, perhaps the strength to believe in hope again. Slowly, she pushed herself to her feet, her movements heavy with resignation and reluctant acceptance. "You're just like him," Tsunade muttered, her voice a mixture of frustration and admiration. "Just like Hiruzen." Naruko smiled, though it was a soft, fleeting thing. "I'll take that as a compliment." Tsunade sighed, casting a glance at Jiraiya, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. "Fine, I'll come back to the village. But don't think for a second that I'm happy about it." Naruko's smile widened slightly, relief washing over her like the first drop of rain after a long drought. That's all we needed to hear. As they left the town behind, the storm clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and brooding. But within the growing shadow, Naruko remained a constant light, a flicker of hope against the encroaching darkness. She blew another bubble from her pipe, watching as it floated up into the sky, its fragile surface catching the first light of dawn before it disappeared. "Balance in all things," Naruko whispered to herself, a mantra, a reminder. The storm was coming, but for now, they would face it together. The road back to Konoha was long, but the company was far from dull. With Jiraiya and Tsunade walking beside her, Naruko had gathered two of the most powerful shinobi in history. As they made their way through the forested paths, the air seemed lighter, but the tension of impending war still hung over them like a distant storm cloud. Beside Tsunade walked Shizune, her loyal apprentice, who had been summoned the moment Tsunade agreed to return. Shizune had always been diligent and focused, her expression often one of quiet concern. She held a deep respect for both Tsunade and Jiraiya, but she couldn't help being curious about Naruko. After all, she had heard rumors about this young Jounin, how she had a way of seeing the world differently, almost like a wise old sage trapped in a youthful body. Naruko led the group with her usual calm demeanor, blowing bubbles from her pipe as she walked. The bubbles floated lazily behind her, catching the sunlight in delicate rainbows. As they drifted, Naruko quietly reflected on the conversations they had shared along the way. She knew that the task ahead of them was daunting, but in the stillness of the forest, there was room for contemplation. So, Naruko, Shizune said after a while, stepping forward to walk alongside her. You've made quite an impression on both Jiraiya and Tsunade-sama. I have to admit, I'm curious. You're not like most shinobi. Naruko smiled gently, her blue eyes thoughtful as she blew another bubble. I guess I see things a little differently. I've always believed that the world isn't just about power or skill. It's about understanding the bigger picture, seeing the connections between everything. Like how a leaf falls from a tree, it doesn't just drop. It dances with the wind, guided by forces we don't always notice. Shizune blinked, caught off guard by the depth of Naruko's words. So, you think everything is connected? Naruko nodded, her voice soft but steady. In a way, yes. Every action we take, no matter how small, creates ripples. It's like throwing a stone into a pond. The ripples spread out, touching everything in their path. We're part of a larger web, whether we realize it or not. Understanding that is key to living fully. Tsunade, walking just behind them, rolled her eyes but couldn't help a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. You really have a way of making everything sound so deep, Naruko. Naruko chuckled softly. Life is deep, Tsunade-sama. Every moment is full of meaning, whether we see it or not. Take Shizune, for example. Shizune looked over, curious. Me? Naruko nodded again, her gaze warm and understanding. You're Tsunade-sama's apprentice, but you're more than that. You care deeply about her, about everyone you meet. You're a healer, yes, but healing isn't just about fixing injuries. It's about understanding the pain people carry and helping them find their way through it. Shizune blinked, clearly moved by Naruko's insight. I guess I never thought of it that way. Naruko smiled. Most people don't, but it's true. You're like a river, Shizune. You flow gently, quietly, but you're always there, guiding others without forcing them. That's a powerful thing. Jiraiya, who had been listening quietly, chuckled. I've always said Naruko's got more wisdom in her than most people twice her age. You could learn a thing or two from her, Tsunade. Tsunade shot him a playful glare. I've got plenty of wisdom of my own, Jiraiya. I just don't spout it off with bubbles. Naruko laughed softly, her expression filled with warmth. Wisdom comes in many forms. Yours is like the strength of a mountain, Tsunade-sama. Strong, unwavering, and always there to protect those who need it. Tsunade raised an eyebrow, though a smile still tugged at her lips. You've got a poetic way of looking at the world, Naruko. I'm not sure how you see me as a mountain, but I'll take it. Naruko's smile softened. You've carried a lot, Tsunade-sama. The loss of those you love, the weight of your responsibilities. But through it all, you've stayed strong. Like a mountain that stands tall, even when storms rage around it. Tsunade glanced away, her expression hardening slightly, though Naruko's words had clearly touched her. Shizune looked between them, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding of the pain Tsunade carried, but also admiration for the way Naruko had framed it. You really believe all of this, don't you? Shizune asked quietly. That everything has meaning? Naruko nodded without hesitation. Yes. Every step we take, every choice we make, it all matters. Even the small things. A single bubble might seem fragile, but it carries the whole world inside it for a brief moment. Just like how every life, no matter how small or fleeting, is full of meaning. Jiraiya, ever the playful one, grinned. You're making me want to blow some bubbles now, Naruko. Naruko winked. You should try it sometime, sensei. It's calming, helps you reflect on things. Tsunade smirked. I don't think there's enough sake in the world to get Jiraiya that philosophical. As they continued their journey, the conversation turned lighter, with Jiraiya cracking jokes and Tsunade bantering back. But Naruko's presence, her quiet wisdom, lingered over them all, giving even the simplest moments a sense of deeper meaning. Shizune, walking beside Naruko, found herself reflecting on everything she had said. It was true. Naruko had a way of seeing the world that made even the most mundane things feel important. She thought back to her time as Tsunade's apprentice, the challenges they had faced, the losses they had endured. Maybe Naruko was right. Maybe there was more to life than just surviving. Maybe there was something profound in the act of simply being, of finding peace, even in the midst of chaos. As they neared Konoha, the air grew heavier again, the tension of the looming conflict creeping back into their thoughts. But now, there was something else, too, something more grounded, more balanced. It was as if Naruko's philosophy had woven its way into their minds, reminding them that even in the face of war, there was meaning to be found. In every breath, in every step, in every decision they made. Naruko, sensing the shift in the group's mood, blew one last bubble from her pipe, watching it float upward before disappearing into the sky. War might be coming, she said softly, her voice carrying over the quiet forest. But even in war, there's room for hope. For peace. We just have to find it, no matter how small it may seem. Shizune smiled softly, her heart lighter. You make it sound so simple. Naruko shook her head gently, her smile never fading. It's not simple, but it's possible, and that's enough. With that, they continued their journey, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. With strength, with wisdom, and, most importantly, with balance. Naruko strode through the gates of Konoha with Jiraiya, Tsunade, and Shizune following closely behind. The tension of the impending war loomed large, but her focus was clear. She had brought back two of the most powerful shinobi in history, but as they neared the Hokage's office, her senses flared, something was wrong. Hiruzen was already waiting when they arrived, his face grave. The moment Naruko laid eyes on him, she knew their conversation would be brief. Hiruzen's gaze locked on hers, and in that instant she understood. Team 7, he said, his voice low but urgent. The wave mission has gone wrong. Naruko's heart skipped a beat. Kakashi's team, Sasuke, Sakura, and Sai, were all out there, and from the way Hiruzen spoke, they were in danger. There was no time for explanations. They're in over their heads, Hiruzen continued. Zabuza has reappeared, and it's worse than we expected. Kakashi's been pinned down, and the others, they need help. Now. Naruko clenched her fists, her mind racing. Zabuza was no ordinary enemy. He was one of the 7 ninja swordsmen of the mist, a lethal opponent. Kakashi could handle him, but with the rest of the team struggling, the situation had clearly spiraled out of control. I'll go, Naruko said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. Jiraiya, Tsunade, and Shizune exchanged glances, but before they could say anything, Naruko was already turning to leave. Hiruzen nodded, his eyes filled with trust. Be quick, they won't last much longer. Naruko left the Hokage's office without another word, her mind focused solely on reaching Team 7 before it was too late. She moved with lightning speed, her form a blur as she darted through the forest toward the wave country. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her mind remained calm, her thoughts steady. She had prepared for moments like this, moments when everything hung in the balance, and only swift action could make the difference. As she neared the bridge where the battle was taking place, Naruko's sharp eyes caught sight of the chaos below. Zabuza, wielding his massive sword, was locked in combat with Kakashi, while Sasuke, Sakura, and Sai were struggling to keep up with Haku's deadly ice mirrors. Kakashi, though powerful, was clearly fatigued, and Team 7 was barely holding their own. Naruko didn't hesitate. In an instant, she launched herself into the fray, her presence announced by a sudden gust of wind and the faint shimmer of bubbles surrounding her. Zabuza's eyes flicked toward her, momentarily distracted by the sudden appearance of this new threat. You're in over your head, Zabuza, Naruko said softly, her voice calm yet filled with authority. Zabuza's grin was feral, his eyes narrowing. So, another one, huh? Doesn't matter. You'll fall just like the rest. Naruko smiled faintly, her pipe already between her lips as she blew a soft stream of bubbles. You underestimate me. Without wasting a second, Naruko began forming hand signs, her chakra flowing effortlessly through her as she prepared her first jutsu. Her eyes locked onto Zabuza as the ground beneath him suddenly softened, transforming into a thick, bubbling mire that began to swallow his feet. Bubble swamp of the underworld, Naruko murmured, her voice steady. The swamp spread rapidly, trapping Zabuza in place as his legs sank deeper into the ground. He growled in frustration, trying to yank himself free, but the swamp clung to him like quicksand, pulling him down with every movement. Kakashi, realizing what Naruko was doing, seized the opportunity to catch his breath and regroup. Sasuke, Sakura, and Sai, momentarily freed from the relentless onslaught, looked up at Naruko in awe. But Naruko wasn't finished yet. With Zabuza immobilized, she took a deep breath and blew another stream of bubbles from her pipe. This time, the bubbles shimmered with a dangerous, flickering glow. Burning ash bubble jutsu, Naruko whispered, her voice carrying a hint of fire. The bubbles floated towards Zabuza, surrounding him in a cloud of delicate orbs. For a moment, it looked almost beautiful, until the bubbles ignited in a burst of searing flames, engulfing Zabuza in a roaring inferno of burning ash. Zabuza howled in pain, his body writhing as the flames licked at his skin. The combination of the swamp holding him in place and the burning ash consuming him left him with little room to maneuver. His strength was formidable, but even he couldn't escape the precision and control of Naruko's jutsu. Naruko stood still, her eyes never leaving Zabuza as the flames continued to burn around him. There was no malice in her gaze, only calm understanding. "Even the strongest must yield when balance is lost," she said softly, her words almost lost in the crackle of flames. As the smoke began to clear, Zabuza, scorched and exhausted, collapsed to the ground, barely conscious. Kakashi moved quickly, restraining him before he could recover, while Naruko turned her attention to Haku, who had been watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Haku hesitated, his gaze flickering between Naruko and the rest of Team 7. For the first time, doubt crept into his expression. Naruko stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "It doesn't have to end like this, Haku. There's still time to choose a different path." Haku's hands trembled, the icy mirrors around Sasuke, Sakura, and Sai beginning to crack. His loyalty to Zabuza was unwavering, but Naruko's presence, her calm strength, her words, seemed to shake him to his core. Haku stammered, his resolve wavering. Naruko's blue eyes softened as she reached out, not with force but with understanding. "You're strong, Haku. Strong enough to make your own choices. Don't let someone else's war destroy you." For a long moment, the bridge was silent, the tension hanging thick in the air. Then, slowly, the mirrors shattered completely, the shards of ice falling harmlessly to the ground. Haku dropped to his knees, his head bowed. Naruko nodded, her expression kind but firm. "You've made the right choice." With Zabuza defeated and Haku standing down, the battle was over. Naruko turned to Kakashi and Team 7, her usual serene smile returning as the immediate danger passed. "Let's get you all back to Konoha," she said, her voice filled with warmth and relief. Kakashi nodded, his expression a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. "Thanks, Naruko. You showed up just in time." Sasuke, Sakura, and Sai, though still processing everything that had just happened, couldn't help but look at Naruko with newfound respect. She had turned the tide of the battle in an instant, not with brute force, but with calm precision and wisdom. As they prepared to leave the bridge behind, Naruko blew one last bubble, watching it float gently into the sky before disappearing. "All things find their balance," she murmured, her voice carrying over the wind. "Even in the chaos of battle." With that, they began their journey back to Konoha, the weight of the mission behind them, and the storm of war still looming on the horizon. But for now, they had found their moment of peace, thanks to Naruko's quiet strength. The gates of Konoha loomed ahead as Naruko, Kakashi, Team 7, and their unexpected new allies, Zabuza and Haku, made their way back into the village. The air was calm, though the tension of the battle they had just faced still lingered. Despite the hard-fought victory, there was an odd sense of quiet in the group. Zabuza, the feared demon of the mist, and Haku, his loyal companion, walked alongside the Konoha shinobi with a sense of unspoken respect, directed largely at Naruko. The events of the battle had spread quickly. Word had gotten out not just about Zabuza's defeat, but also about the mysterious Jounin who had brought him to his knees using nothing but her gentle jutsu and wise words. And with the spread of that story, a new name had started circulating, the Bubble Sage. Naruko walked at the head of the group, her pipe tucked into her sash as she blew occasional bubbles into the wind. The simple act seemed calming to her, a way of centering herself as she reflected on the events that had unfolded. Zabuza and Haku, though not bound by force, kept pace with her, intrigued by the woman who had defeated them without a single shred of malice. As they approached the Hokage's office, Zabuza broke the silence. "So, you're the one they call Bubble Sage, now, huh?" His voice was rough, though there was a hint of curiosity behind it. Naruko glanced at him, her eyes soft and filled with the same quiet wisdom that had left such an impression on him during their fight. "It's just a title," she said simply. "People love titles. They give them meaning where they think none exists." Haku, who had been listening quietly, spoke up, his voice soft but filled with genuine curiosity. But why bubbles? Out of all the techniques I've seen, yours is so different. Gentle, yet powerful. Naruko smiled faintly, blowing another bubble from her pipe. Bubbles are fragile, aren't they? They float through the air, delicate and light, yet within them, they hold something beautiful. Just like life. It may seem fragile at times, but within that fragility, there is strength. Zabuza scoffed, though not without a trace of amusement. Philosophical, as always. Naruko nodded slightly, her expression thoughtful. Life is philosophical. Every choice we make, every path we take, it all carries weight, even when we don't realize it. Bubbles remind me of that. They're fleeting, but in their brief existence, they reflect the world around them. They capture everything, even if just for a moment. Haku listened intently, his eyes filled with a quiet admiration. He had always believed in following Zabuza, in being a tool for his cause, but Naruko's way of seeing the world was different. It wasn't about power or control. It was about balance, understanding, and something deeper, something that resonated with him in a way he hadn't expected. As they entered the Hokage's office, Hiruzen looked up from his desk, his eyes immediately flicking to Zabuza and Haku. His expression was unreadable, but Naruko stepped forward, her calm demeanor unshaken. Hiruzen-sensei, she began, bowing slightly. Zabuza and Haku have chosen a different path. They've agreed to join us to help Konoha. Hiruzen studied the two former enemies for a long moment before nodding slowly. I trust your judgment, Naruko. If they've chosen to come to our side, then I welcome them. Zabuza crossed his arms, his sharp eyes still locked on Naruko. Don't get me wrong, old man. I didn't come here for the village. I came because I'm interested in her. Hiruzen raised an eyebrow but said nothing, allowing Zabuza to continue. She's not like other shinobi, Zabuza said, his voice low but intense. She beat me without ever lifting a blade, without ever trying to destroy me. That kind of strength, it's different. And I want to understand it. Naruko met Zabuza's gaze, her eyes calm but filled with understanding. Strength isn't always about power, Zabuza. Sometimes, it's about knowing when to stop fighting. When to see the person behind the blade. Haku, standing beside Zabuza, nodded in agreement. Naruko-sensei, during the battle, you showed me that I didn't have to follow the same path forever. You helped me see that there's more to life than just being a tool. For that, I'm grateful. Hiruzen leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. It seems you've had quite an impact, Naruko. As always. Naruko smiled softly, her gaze drifting toward the window. It's not about impact, Hiruzen-sensei. It's about helping people see the balance in themselves. Zabuza and Haku, they've both lived lives filled with conflict, but even in the darkest moments, there's always light. You just have to be willing to look for it. Zabuza, who was never one for long speeches, grunted in approval. If following you means understanding that, then I'll stick around. But don't expect me to blow bubbles. Naruko laughed softly, a rare sound that seemed to lighten the room. I wouldn't dream of it. Hiruzen nodded, satisfied. Very well. Zabuza, Haku, welcome to Konoha. Naruko, I trust you'll continue to guide them as you've done so far. Naruko bowed slightly. Of course. As they left the Hokage's office, Zabuza and Haku walked quietly behind Naruko, their thoughts still filled with the battle, the wisdom she had shared, and the strange calmness that seemed to follow her everywhere she went. Bubble Sage, huh? Zabuza muttered, a faint smirk on his face. It suits you. Naruko smiled, blowing another bubble into the air. Perhaps. But in the end, titles don't matter. What matters is what we do with the time we have. Haku, his eyes filled with a newfound sense of purpose, nodded. You're right, Naruko-sensei. I want to learn more about that. About balance, about finding peace in the chaos. Naruko glanced back at them, her smile warm and welcoming. Then you're in the right place. Konoha is more than just a village. It's a chance for all of us to find that balance. And with that, the three of them continued forward, leaving the past behind and walking toward a future filled with the quiet, powerful wisdom that Naruko embodied. The Bubble Sage, a name that carried more meaning than most would ever understand. THSTA all for now. If you enjoy then please like, share and do comments.